This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. It was September 2023. My girlfriend Lisa and I had been planning a camping trip with our friends John and Mary for weeks. We were all excited to spend a weekend away from the city, surrounded by nature at the Todd Lake Recreation Area in George Washington National Forest. The drive there was beautiful, winding mountain roads, forests blazing with early fall colors. We arrived Friday afternoon and set up our tents at the campground. Everything seemed perfect. Crisp autumn air, the sound of leaves rustling, that woodsy smell. We spent the evening grilling burgers, laughing around the campfire, catching up. As night fell, we cracked open some beers, Keltis lagers, John's favorite. I'm not usually a big drinker, but the mood was so relaxed and fun. Before we knew it, we'd each had 3 or 4. We were all feeling good, not wasted, just pleasantly buzzed. Someone suggested taking a walk down to the lake to look at the stars. It seemed like a great idea at the time. I remember stumbling a bit as we made our way down the trail, the beams of our flashlights bobbing through the darkness. The lake was beautiful in the moonlight, so still it looked like glass. We stood on the shore, skipping rocks for a while, goofing around. And then, nothing. My next clear memory is waking up on the forest floor, completely disoriented. Lisa was next to me, also just coming to. We had no idea where we were or how we'd gotten there. My watch said it was 3:47 a.m. I felt awful, pounding headache, nausea, chills. Way worse than any hangover I've ever had. Lisa said she felt the same. We both had an overwhelming feeling of dread, like we were being watched. I kept seeing movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I'd turned to look, there was nothing there. It took us nearly an hour of confused wandering to find our way back to the campsite. John and Mary's tent was empty. We called out for them but got no response. We were starting to really freak out when Mary suddenly emerged from the woods. She looked dazed and said she'd woken up alone by the lakeshore. No sign of John anywhere. We searched for hours but couldn't find him. As the sun came up, we drove to the ranger station in a panic to report him missing. They immediately launched a search. John stumbled out of the woods on his own later that morning, about 5 miles from our campsite. He was dehydrated and confused, with no memory of the night before. None of us could explain what had happened. We'd only had a few beers, not nearly enough to cause blackouts or memory loss. And how had we ended up scattered in different places? The whole thing felt surreal and terrifying. The rangers checked the area, but found nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of any other people or vehicles. No evidence of foul play. They suggested maybe we'd taken some kind of drug without realizing it. But we hadn't taken anything other than the beer we brought ourselves. In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to piece it together. Could someone have drugged our drinks when we weren't looking? But who and why? We were the only ones at that end of the campground. I started researching similar incidents and came across stories of supposed alien abductions. The lost time, memory loss, and feelings of being watched were common elements. But that seemed too crazy to be real. I've never believed in that kind of thing. Some of the symptoms, nausea, disorientation, lost time, also fit with exposure to certain toxic gases that can occur naturally in some forests. But that doesn't explain how we ended up in different locations. I've gone over and over it in my mind. Maybe we all just got really drunk and wandered off in different directions. But 4 people simultaneously getting blackout drunk off a few beers and having identical symptoms doesn't make sense. And I know my alcohol tolerance, A few Keltis lagers shouldn't have affected me that strongly. The worst part is the lingering fear and unease. I have trouble sleeping, constantly feeling like I'm being watched. Lisa says she has vivid nightmares about bright lights and strange figures. John developed a weird rash all over his body that doctors can't explain. Mary's been having nosebleeds and headaches. I can't shake the feeling that something sinister happened that night. Something beyond ordinary explanation. But I have no proof, no clear memories. Just a gnawing sense of wrongness that won't go away. We haven't been camping since. Can't bring ourselves to go back into the woods. The four of us have grown distant. I think we all just want to forget that night ever happened. But I can't. I need to know the truth. I've thought about going back to Todd Lake to investigate, but I'm terrified of what I might find, or what might find me. Some part of me feels like it's not over, like whatever happened that night is still out there, waiting. I know this probably sounds insane. Believe me, I've wondered if I'm losing my mind, but I know what I experienced was real. Something happened to us out there in those woods, something that defies explanation, and not knowing is slowly driving me crazy. Has anyone else ever experienced anything like this? Am I crazy for considering paranormal explanations? I feel like I'm grasping at straws, but I'm desperate for answers. Any theories or insights would be appreciated. I just want to understand what happened to us that night at Todd Lake. I'm sorry if this is all over the place. It's hard to talk about. Writing it all out has my hands shaking. That feeling of being watched is creeping up again. I keep telling myself it's just paranoia, but deep down I'm not so sure. Whatever it was, I don't think it's finished with us yet. The bus ride there was full of chatter and laughter as we all speculated about what adventures awaited us. When we arrived at the campsite, nestled in a wooded area, I was struck by how peaceful and beautiful it seemed. The air was crisp and clean, birds were chirping, and I felt a sense of freedom being away from the usual routines of home and school. We spent that first afternoon setting up our tents and getting oriented to the campsite. Our teachers went over the rules and schedule, reminding us to stay with a buddy at all times and not to wander off into the woods alone. As night fell, we gathered around a campfire to roast marshmallows and tell spooky stories. Looking back now, it's ironic how those made-up tales pale in comparison to the real horror we were about to face. I drifted off to sleep that night feeling content, cozy in my sleeping bag next to my best friend Emma. But sometime in the early hours of the morning, I was jolted awake by raised voices outside. At first, in my groggy state, I thought it was just some of the rowdier boys horsing around. But as I became more alert, I realized the voices sounded angry and there was an edge of panic. "You shouldn't be here. This is private property," a gruff male voice bellowed. "Sir, please calm down. We have permission to camp here," I heard Mr. Thompson, one of our teachers, say in a placating tone. Curious and a bit alarmed, I unzipped the tent flap and peeked out. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was a man standing at the edge of our campsite, partially illuminated by the dying embers of the fire. He was tall and imposing, with a wild, tangled beard and piercing eyes that seemed to glow in the dim light. But what struck me as truly odd was his attire. He wore a disheveled suit that looked out of place in the woods, paired incongruously with muddy Wellington boots. "You don't understand," the man shouted, gesticulating wildly. "You're all in danger. You need to leave now." By this point, other kids were waking up and poking their heads out of tents. I could hear whimpers and frightened whispers rippling through the campsite. Ms. Davis, another teacher, was hurriedly trying to usher kids back into their tents, while Mr. Thompson continued attempting to reason with the agitated stranger. "Sir, we're not going anywhere in the middle of the night. If there's a problem, we can discuss it calmly in the morning," Mr. Thompson said firmly. But the man was having none of it. He began pacing back and forth, muttering to himself and occasionally shooting us all wild-eyed looks. "You don't know what you've done, what you've awakened," he rambled. "It's coming for you all." A chill ran down my spine. What was he talking about? What had we supposedly awakened? My imagination began running wild with possibilities, each more terrifying than the last. Suddenly, the man lunged forward, grabbing Mr. Thompson by the shirt. "Listen to me," he snarled. "You need to get these children out of here now before it's too late." Everything erupted into chaos then. Kids started screaming and crying. Ms. Davis was shouting for everyone to stay in their tents. Mr. Thompson struggled to break free from the man's grip while yelling for someone to call the police. In the midst of the commotion, I locked eyes with the stranger for a brief moment. The raw fear and desperation I saw there chilled me to my core. This wasn't just some unstable person or prankster. He genuinely believed we were in grave danger. Eventually, Mr. Thompson managed to shove the man away, and he stumbled backwards. For a tense moment, I thought he might attack again. But instead, he cast one last frantic look around the campsite before turning and sprinting off into the dark woods. "Everyone back in your tents now," Mr. Thompson ordered, his voice shaky but authoritative. "Pack up your things quickly and quietly. We're leaving as soon as it's light out." The rest of that night was a blur of hushed, frightened conversations and fitful attempts at sleep. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves outside made me flinch, imagining the wild-eyed man returning, or something worse. As soon as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we were hustled onto the bus and driven back to town. The police met us there to take statements. They assured us they would investigate, but I could tell from their skeptical expressions that they thought it was just some local nutter who'd had too much to drink. But I knew what I'd seen in that man's eyes. Whatever he was afraid of, it was real to him. And now, all these years later, I still find myself wondering, what if he was right? What if there really was some malevolent presence in those woods that we narrowly escaped? I've tried researching the history of Merchant's Hill over the years, looking for any clues about what the man might have been referring to. There are vague references to old legends and ghost stories associated with the area, but nothing concrete. Sometimes I wonder if I should try to go back there as an adult to see if I can make sense of what happened. But then I remember the raw terror in that stranger's voice, the way he looked at us like lambs to the slaughter, and I know I never want to set foot in those woods again. That camping trip was supposed to be a fun adventure, a chance to create happy childhood memories. Instead, it left me with lingering fears and unanswered questions that haunt me to this day. I still can't shake the feeling that we narrowly escaped something truly sinister that night, something that might still be lurking in the shadows, waiting for unwary campers to stumble into its domain. I had been so excited for this music festival. It was only my second one ever, and I was ready to have the time of my life with my friends Tom and Gina. We had been planning this trip for months, saving up and picking out the perfect outfits. The energy when we first arrived was electric. Music pumping, people dancing everywhere, good vibes all around. Things started to go south on the second night. We had all taken acid earlier in the day, and I was still deep in the trip as night fell. The lights and sounds were overwhelming, and I started to feel disconnected from reality. I turned to tell Tom I needed a break, but when I looked around, I realized I had somehow gotten separated from my friends in the crowd. Panic set in immediately. I stumbled through the sea of people, desperately scanning faces for Tom and Gina. Everything was a blur of neon and noise. I called their names, but my voice was lost in the music. My heart was racing, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I needed to get out of there. I pushed my way to the edge of the crowd and collapsed onto the grass, trying to calm myself down. I had no idea where I was or how to get back to our campsite. My phone was dead. I was alone and terrified, the acid heightening every sensation and emotion. That's when these two guys approached me. They seemed friendly at first, asking if I was okay. I must have looked like a mess. When I explained I was lost and couldn't find my friends, they offered to help me back to my tent. In my altered state, all I could think was how relieved I was that someone was being nice to me. They led me away from the festival grounds, saying they knew a shortcut. We walked for what felt like forever, getting farther and farther from the lights and music. My legs were shaky, and I was so disoriented. I started to get an uneasy feeling, but I told myself I was just being paranoid from the drugs. We came to a small clearing where an old trailer was parked. One of the guys said we could rest there for a bit and use his phone to call my friends. It didn't seem right, but I was exhausted and still tripping hard. I just wanted to sit down. As soon as we got inside, everything changed. One of them grabbed me and tried to push me onto the bed. I screamed and fought back, kicking and clawing at them. Adrenaline surged through me as I realized the danger I was in. Somehow, I managed to break free and bolt for the door. I ran blindly into the darkness, branches whipping my face and tearing at my clothes. I could hear them crashing through the woods behind me. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, fueled by sheer terror. My bare feet were bleeding from sharp rocks, but I couldn't stop. I don't know how long I ran for. Eventually, I broke through the tree line and found myself on the edge of a campground. I spotted a group of people sitting around a fire and ran towards them, sobbing and begging for help. They were alarmed by my appearance. I was covered in cuts and bruises, my clothes torn, totally hysterical. This lovely older couple took me under their wing. They got me water, wrapped me in a blanket, and let me use their phone to call Tom and Gina. I was still crying uncontrollably, the acid making it hard to explain what had happened. When my friends finally found me, I broke down all over again. The rest of that night is a blur. I know the police were called, but in my state I couldn't give them much useful information. I was taken to the medical tent to get checked out. Physically, I was okay aside from cuts and bruises, but mentally, I was shattered. We left the festival early the next morning. I was too traumatized to stay another day. The drive home was mostly silent. I think my friends didn't know what to say. I felt so ashamed and stupid for getting myself into that situation. If I had just stayed with the group, if I hadn't taken those drugs, the what-ifs were endless. It's been months now, and I'm still dealing with the aftermath. I have nightmares about those men catching me in the woods. I get panic attacks in crowds. I haven't been able to go to any concerts or festivals since then. My friends try to be supportive, but I can tell they don't really understand. How can you explain that kind of fear to someone who hasn't experienced it? I keep replaying that night in my head, trying to make sense of it. How did I get so far from the festival? Why did those men target me? What would have happened if I hadn't gotten away? The not knowing is almost worse than the memories themselves. I'm working with a therapist now, trying to process the trauma. She says it will take time, but that I'll get through this. Some days I believe her. Other days it feels like I'll never be the same carefree person I was before. I know I'm lucky it wasn't worse. I read stories of girls who don't escape, who are never found. But that doesn't make the fear and anxiety go away. I'm jumpy all the time now, always looking over my shoulder. I have a hard time trusting people, especially men I don't know. The hardest part is feeling like a piece of my youth and innocence was stolen that night. I used to love going to shows and festivals, losing myself in the music and atmosphere. Now the thought of being in a crowd makes me break out in a cold sweat. Will I ever be able to enjoy those things again? Or will I always be haunted by the memory of running through those dark woods, certain I was about to die? I'm trying to stay positive and focus on healing, but it's a daily struggle. Sometimes I get angry at those men, at my friends for leaving me, at myself for being so naive. Other times, I'm just sad for the girl I used to be, who thought the worst thing that could happen at a festival was a bad trip or losing her phone. I know I can't let this experience define me forever. I'm more than what happened that night. But right now, it feels like my life is divided into before and after. I'm still figuring out who this after version of me is. Some days are better than others. I'm taking it one day at a time, trying to be gentle with myself as I navigate this new reality. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's to trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And never, ever leave your friends behind, no matter how messed up you are. The buddy system exists for a reason. I just wish I hadn't had to learn that lesson in such a traumatic way. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand or come to terms with what happened that night. The whole thing still feels surreal, like a nightmare I can't quite shake. But I'm still here. I survived. And someday, I hope I'll be able to feel safe and free again. Until then, I'm taking it one day at a time, trying to reclaim the parts of myself I lost in those woods. To anyone reading this who's been through something similar, you're not alone. It wasn't your fault. And there is hope, even when it feels like there isn't. We're stronger than we know. If I can make it through this, so can you. Stay safe out there and look out for each other. You never know when you might be someone's lifeline in their darkest moment. I'm a 20-year-old guy from Finland, and I had been backpacking around Europe for a few months. Greece was my last stop before heading home. I had heard hitchhiking was pretty common there, especially for tourists, so I decided to give it a try to save some money. It was a hot summer day when I found myself on the outskirts of Kalamata, thumb out, hoping to catch a ride north towards Sparta. I had been waiting for about an hour when an older man in a beat-up Fiat pulled over. He looked to be in his 50s, with graying hair and a bit of a beer belly. His English wasn't great, but he managed to communicate that he was heading in the direction of Sparta and could give me a lift. I was relieved to finally get a ride and tossed my backpack in the trunk before hopping in the passenger seat. The car smelled strongly of cigarettes, and there were empty beer cans rolling around on the floor, but I tried not to judge. I was just grateful for the ride. As we set off, the man introduced himself as Nikos and asked me the usual questions: where I was from, how long I'd been traveling, that sort of thing. I kept my answers pretty short, not wanting to give away too much personal information to a stranger. Something about him made me a bit uneasy, though I couldn't put my finger on why exactly. We had been driving for maybe 30 minutes when Nikos suddenly turned off the main road onto a narrow dirt path heading up into the mountains. My heart started racing immediately. This definitely wasn't the way to Sparta. Where are we going?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "Shortcut," Nikos replied with a dismissive wave of his hand. "My house close. We stop for drink. then keep going. Every instinct was screaming at me that this was bad news, but I didn't know what to do. We were in the middle of nowhere, and I had no cell service. I considered trying to jump out of the moving car, but we were on a steep mountain road with a sheer drop on one side. I felt utterly trapped. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10-15 minutes, we pulled up to a small run-down house perched on the mountainside. It looked like it hadn't been maintained in years, with peeling paint and overgrown weeds everywhere. Nikos got out and motioned for me to follow him inside. My legs felt like jelly as I stepped out of the car. I briefly considered making a run for it, but we were so isolated I had no idea which way to go. And Nikos had the car keys, so I couldn't even try to steal the car to escape. With a deep sense of dread, I followed him into the dimly lit house. The interior was just as neglected as the outside. Dusty furniture, cobwebs in the corners, a musty smell permeating everything. Nikos gestured for me to sit on a sagging couch while he went to the kitchen, returning with 2 glasses and a bottle of what looked like homemade liquor. He poured us each a generous glass and raised his in a toast. "To new friends," he said with a leer that made my skin crawl. I pretended to take a sip, not wanting to risk being drugged. Nikos drained his glass in one long gulp, then poured himself another. As he drank, his demeanor changed. The facade of friendly hospitality dropped away, replaced by something much darker. "You are a very handsome boy," he slurred, moving to sit uncomfortably close to me on the couch. I shifted away, but he just scooted closer. "I bet many girls like you, yes? Maybe some boys too?" I mumbled something non-committal, desperately trying to think of a way out of this nightmare. Nikos put his hand on my knee, squeezing it as he leaned in close. The stench of alcohol on his breath made me gag. "I like handsome young men like you," he whispered. "We can have fun together, just us. No one has to know." I jumped to my feet, knocking over my untouched drink in the process. "I'm not interested," I said firmly, backing away. "I think I should go now." Nikos's face twisted in anger. He lunged at me, trying to grab my arm. I dodged him and bolted for the door, fumbling with the locks with shaking hands. I could hear him shouting and stumbling after me. I finally got the door open and ran outside, not daring to look back. I sprinted down the dirt road as fast as I could, my backpack bouncing painfully against my spine. I half expected to hear the roar of the Fiat's engine as Nikos came after me, but there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing and pounding heart. I ran until my lungs were burning and my legs felt like they would give out. Only then did I slow to a jog, constantly looking over my shoulder. I had no idea where I was or how to get back to the main road. The late afternoon sun was sinking lower, and I knew I didn't want to be lost in these mountains after dark. Just as panic was starting to set in, I heard the distant rumble of a vehicle. I ducked behind some bushes, terrified it might be Nikos. But as it got closer, I saw it was a small pickup truck driven by an elderly couple. I took a chance and flagged them down, babbling out a story about getting lost while hiking. They didn't speak much English, but seemed to understand I needed help. They gestured for me to hop in the back of the truck. As we bounced down the mountain roads, the adrenaline started to wear off, and the full impact of what had almost happened hit me. I curled up in the truck bed and sobbed, overwhelmed by fear and relief. The kind couple dropped me off in Sparta, refusing any payment. I immediately went to the police station to report what had happened, but with my limited Greek and their limited English, I'm not sure how much they understood or if they took it seriously. I ended up taking a bus to Athens the next day, too shaken to attempt hitchhiking again. For the rest of my trip, and even after I returned home to Finland, I was jumpy and on edge. I had trouble sleeping, plagued by nightmares of what might have happened if I hadn't gotten away. It's been a few years now, but I still get anxious thinking about that day. I know I was incredibly lucky to escape relatively unharmed. The experience completely changed how I view traveling alone and trusting strangers. I'm much more cautious now, always making sure someone knows where I am and having a backup plan. I often wonder if Nikos ever faced any consequences, or if he's still out there preying on vulnerable young travelers. The thought makes me sick. I hope by sharing my story, I can warn others to be careful and trust their instincts. What started as an adventure could have ended in tragedy, and I'll never take my safety for granted again. I still get chills thinking about that camping trip to Palmetto Island when I was 9. It was supposed to be a fun family getaway, but it turned into the scariest day of my life. We had arrived at the campground the day before, and I was so excited to explore the woods and go fishing in the lake. That morning, my parents were busy setting up our site while my older sister helped cook breakfast. I asked if I could go check out the nearby trail real quick before we ate. My mom said okay, but to stay close and be back in 10 minutes. I grabbed my baseball cap and headed off down the path, kicking pine cones as I went. The forest was thick and green, with shafts of early morning sunlight filtering through the leaves. I breathed in the fresh air, feeling like a real adventurer. Before I knew it, I had walked much farther than I meant to. The trail forked and curved, and I realized I wasn't sure which way I had come from anymore. My heart started to beat faster as I spun around, trying to get my bearings. Everything looked the same, just endless trees in every direction. I called out for my parents, but there was no response except for some birds chirping overhead. Panic started to set in as I realized I was actually lost. I picked a direction and started walking quickly, hoping to find my way back, but nothing looked familiar. After what felt like hours of wandering, but was probably only 30 minutes or so, I was in full-blown terror mode. Tears streamed down my face as I stumbled along, calling out desperately for help. My legs were scratched up from pushing through bushes, and I was covered in dirt and sweat. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I heard a vehicle approaching on a nearby road. Relief washed over me. Finally, someone who could help. I ran towards the sound and emerged onto a gravel access road, just as an old blue pickup truck came around the bend. The truck slowed to a stop, and a man leaned out the window. He was probably in his 40s, with greasy hair and a scruffy beard. "Hey there, little buddy. You lost?" he called out in a gruff voice. I nodded, wiping tears from my eyes. Yes, sir. I got separated from my family at the campground. Can you help me find them?" The man's face broke into a wide grin that made me uneasy for some reason. "Well, sure thing. Hop on in and I'll give you a ride back," he said, reaching over to open the passenger door. Something in my gut told me this wasn't right. My parents had drilled stranger danger into me, and alarm bells were going off in my head. But I was so scared and desperate to get back that I started to take a step towards the truck. Just then, I heard shouting in the distance. "Tommy! Tommy, where are you?" It was my dad's voice. The man in the truck's eyes widened. He quickly said, "Never mind, kid. Looks like your folks found you," and peeled away down the road in a cloud of dust. Moments later, my dad came crashing through the underbrush, red-faced and frantic. When he saw me, he let out a huge sigh of relief and crushed me in a bear hug. I burst into tears again, so grateful to be found. As we walked back to the campsite, I told my dad about the man in the truck who had offered me a ride. His face turned pale, and he gripped my shoulder tightly. "Thank God I got there when I did," he muttered. We reported the incident to the park rangers, who immediately put out an alert. To everyone's shock, The man was actually apprehended later that day trying to lure another child at a different campground about 20 miles away. It turned out he was part of a family that had been involved in multiple child abductions across several states. They would target campgrounds and other outdoor areas where kids might get separated from their parents. I get sick thinking about what might have happened if my dad hadn't found me in time. The rest of that camping trip was a blur. My parents were understandably shaken, and we ended up going home early. For months afterwards, I had nightmares about getting lost in the woods and that creepy man finding me. Even now, over 20 years later, I still get anxious in unfamiliar wooded areas. That day left an indelible mark on me. I'm so incredibly lucky that I trusted my instincts and hesitated getting in that truck. And I'm beyond grateful that my dad's voice came calling out at that exact moment. I often wonder about the other kids who weren't so fortunate, the ones who did get in vehicles with strangers and were never seen again. It's a chilling reminder of how quickly a normal day can turn into a nightmare, and how important it is to be vigilant about safety. Whenever I take my own kids camping now, I'm hyper-aware of where they are at all times. Some might call me overprotective, but unless you've had a brush with true evil like I did that day, you can't understand the lingering fear it leaves behind. I try not to dwell on the what-ifs too much, but sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I can still hear the crunch of gravel under that blue truck's tires and see that man's unsettling grin. It's a stark reminder of how fragile our safety can be and how life can change in an instant. That camping trip taught me that the world can be a dangerous place, even in seemingly idyllic settings. But it also showed me the power of trusting your instincts and the fierce protective love of family. I'll never forget the relief of hearing my dad's voice calling out for me, or the crushing hug when he found me safe. In the years since, I've done a lot of healing and processing of that traumatic day. Therapy has helped me work through the residual anxiety and hypervigilance. I've learned coping mechanisms for when those old fears start creeping back in. But I also think the experience gave me a unique perspective and appreciation for life. I don't take my safety or my loved ones for granted. I try to live each day fully and cherish the time I have with my family, knowing how easily it could have all been taken away. I still love nature and the outdoors, but I approach it with a healthy respect and caution now. I always make sure to have a solid plan, let others know where I'm going, and stay aware of my surroundings. That day taught me that a little preparation can make all the difference. Sometimes I think about reaching out to other survivors of attempted abductions, to connect with people who truly understand that unique trauma. But then I worry about dredging up old wounds or inviting that darkness back into my life. For now, I try to focus on the present and the beautiful life I've built. I hope that by sharing my story, I can help others stay vigilant and trust their instincts. That gut feeling I had about not getting in the truck likely saved my life. I want other kids and adults to know it's okay to listen to that inner voice, even if it means being perceived as rude or paranoid. Life is precious and can change in an instant. That day on Palmetto Island could have ended so differently. I'm eternally grateful for the twist of fate that brought my dad to that road at that exact moment. It's a reminder to cherish every day and hold our loved ones close. So if you're reading this and planning a camping trip or any kind of outdoor adventure, please be careful out there. Have fun, but stay alert. And parents, keep a close eye on your little ones. The world can be a magical place, but there are also real dangers lurking. Stay safe, trust your gut, and don't take a single moment for granted. When we first arrived, everything seemed idyllic. We set up our tent in a clearing surrounded by towering pines with a babbling creek nearby. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of pine needles. That first afternoon we went for a short hike, marveling at the mountain views and vibrant wildflowers. We felt so lucky to have this slice of paradise all to ourselves. As night fell, we built a campfire and cuddled up together, gazing at the dazzling canopy of stars overhead. It was incredibly romantic until we heard it. A low rumbling noise, almost like a jet engine, seemingly coming from somewhere in the forest. We looked at each other in confusion. There shouldn't be any air traffic out here in the wilderness. The sound faded after a minute or two. "Probably just the wind," Jake said with a shrug. I nodded, but felt uneasy. We climbed into our tent and drifted off to sleep. I woke suddenly in the middle of the night, my heart racing. That rumbling noise was back, louder this time, and there was something else. Whispers, so faint I could barely make them out. I shook Jake awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered urgently. He listened for a moment, then nodded slowly, his eyes wide. "What the hell is that?" The noises continued for several long minutes before fading away again. Neither of us slept much after that. The next morning, everything seemed normal again in the bright sunlight. We tried to laugh off our fears from the night before, but as we hiked that day, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. Every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. When we returned to our campsite that evening, I noticed something odd. The couple we'd seen setting up their tent in a nearby clearing was gone. Their entire campsite had vanished without a trace. "That's weird," I said to Jake. "Maybe they just packed up and left early?" He frowned. "I guess. But why wouldn't we have seen or heard them leaving?" As night fell again, the oppressive feeling of being observed intensified. I kept seeing flashes of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. We decided to turn in early, both on edge. I tossed and turned, unable to relax. Around midnight, I heard Jake gasp beside me. "Babe, wake up," he whispered urgently, shaking my shoulder. I opened my eyes and nearly screamed. The walls of our tent seemed to be rippling, undulating like waves on water. I blinked hard, sure I must be dreaming. But the unsettling visual distortion continued. "What's happening?" I choked out. Before Jake could answer, that jet engine rumble started up again, so loud now it seemed to vibrate through my entire body. The whispers returned too, but this time I could almost make out words. They sounded wrong somehow, inhuman. We clung to each other, paralyzed with fear as the noises and visual anomalies intensified. The very air felt charged with a malevolent energy. Suddenly, a blinding flash of blue-white light flooded our tent. In that split second, I caught a glimpse of something. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, with gray skin and huge black eyes. Then everything went dark. When I came to, watery early morning light was filtering through the tent walls. Jake was shaking me gently. "We need to go, now." His voice was steady, but I could see the fear in his eyes. We packed up in record time, our hands shaking. As we hurried down the trail to our car, I glanced back at our campsite. For a moment, I could have sworn I saw dozens of those gray figures standing silently among the trees, watching us go. I blinked, and they were gone. We drove for hours in tense silence before finally pulling over at a rest stop. Jake turned to me, his face pale. What do you think happened back there?" he asked quietly. I shook my head, fighting back tears. "I don't know, but I never want to go back to that place again." In the days and weeks that followed, we tried to rationalize what we'd experienced, Maybe it was some kind of shared hallucination brought on by tainted water or toxic plants. Maybe we'd accidentally ingested something psychoactive. But deep down, I knew those explanations didn't fit. Whatever happened in those Colorado woods was real and not of this world. Sometimes I still wake up in a cold sweat, remembering those inhuman whispers and that haunting glimpse of gray figures in the forest. I don't know if it was aliens, interdimensional beings, or something else entirely. All I know is that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, and sometimes it's better not to go looking for answers. We never went camping again after that. Some experiences change you forever. I just hope whatever we encountered out there stays in those woods, far away from civilization. But on dark nights when I hear a faint rumble in the distance, I can't help but wonder, what if it followed us home? The day started off beautiful, crisp fall air, leaves just starting to change color. I hit the trailhead early, planning to do a long loop through some of the more isolated parts of the mountains. The first few hours were great. I was making good time and enjoying the solitude. But as I got deeper into the wilderness, things started to feel off. The forest seemed to get denser, the tree canopy blocking out more and more sunlight. The usual forest sounds, birds chirping, leaves rustling, began to fade away until it was eerily quiet. I tried to shake off the growing unease, telling myself I was just being paranoid. Then I remembered the stories I'd heard about this area. Locals call it the Bennington Triangle because of all the strange disappearances over the years. Hikers, hunters, even whole groups of college students vanished without a trace. I'd always written those off as campfire tales, but being there in that oppressive silence, they suddenly felt very real. I picked up my pace, eager to finish the loop and get back to my car, but the trail seemed to stretch on endlessly. I checked my map and GPS, but nothing made sense. I should have reached the halfway point hours ago. It was like the forest itself was shifting around me, leading me deeper in. The trees pressed in closer, branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Mist started rolling in, reducing visibility to just a few feet ahead. My heart was pounding. I felt like something was watching me, following just out of sight. I broke into a run, no longer caring about following the trail. I just needed to get out. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I burst out of the tree line into a small clearing. There was an old fire tower, its metal frame rusted but still standing. I scrambled up the stairs, not stopping until I reached the top platform. From up there, I could finally see over the forest canopy. The mist had lifted, and I could make out distant peaks. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath, my whole body shaking with exhaustion and lingering fear. I stayed up there for hours, unable to bring myself to go back down into those woods. As the sun began to set, I finally spotted a road in the distance and was able to plot a route out. I made it back to my car well after dark, scratched up and utterly drained. It's been days now, and I still can't shake the feeling of dread I experienced in those woods. I keep replaying it in my mind, trying to make sense of what happened. How did I get so lost on a well-marked trail? Why did the forest feel so menacing, so alive? What was following me? I've hiked all over and never experienced anything like that before. It was like the forest itself was trying to swallow me up, to make me another unsolved disappearance. I can't explain it rationally, but I know what I felt. Something is not right in those mountains. I've been obsessively researching the Bennington Triangle since I got back. So many others have had similar experiences, feeling watched, getting inexplicably lost, sensing a malevolent presence. And those are just the ones who made it out to tell their stories. How many others weren't so lucky? I keep thinking about those missing hikers and students. Did they experience the same terror I did in those final moments? Are they still out there somewhere, trapped in those endless shifting woods? The thought makes me sick. I know it probably sounds crazy. If someone had told me this story a week ago, I would have thought they were making it up or had let their imagination run wild. But I know what I experienced. That forest is alive in some way, and it's hungry. I've always considered myself a rational person, but this has shaken my whole world view. There are things out there we can't explain, forces beyond our understanding. I feel like I brushed up against something ancient and terrifying, something that defies our normal laws of reality. I haven't been able to sleep properly since that day. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back in those suffocating woods, running for my life from some unseen threat. I startle at every shadow, every creaking floorboard. It's like a piece of that forest followed me home. I don't know if I'll ever be able to go hiking again, at least not alone. The thought of being in the wilderness now fills me with dread, which is heartbreaking because nature has always been my sanctuary. But now I know the darkness that can lurk in those peaceful forests. I'm sharing this as a warning to others. If you're planning to hike in the Green Mountains, especially in the Bennington area, please be careful. Go with a group, stick to well-traveled trails, and trust your instincts. If something feels off, get out of there immediately. I consider myself lucky to have escaped. The forest let me go that day, but I can't shake the feeling that it was a near thing. One wrong turn, one moment of hesitation, and I might have become another mysterious statistic, another unsolved disappearance in the Bennington Triangle. I'm still trying to process everything that happened. Part of me wants to go back, to try to understand what's really going on in those mountains. But a bigger part of me never wants to set foot in those woods again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. For now, I'm just trying to move on with my life and put the experience behind me. But I know I'll never forget the terror of that day, the feeling of being hunted by something I couldn't see or understand. Those mountains have a secret, and I came far too close to becoming a part of it. So if you're ever hiking in Vermont and the forest starts to feel too quiet, too dense, too alive, turn back. Don't let curiosity or pride push you forward. There are things in this world we're not meant to encounter, forces that can swallow us whole. I learned that lesson the hard way, and I'll carry it with me for the rest of my life. I'd find myself face to face with a wild elephant, let alone have one nearly crush me inside my own tent. But that's exactly what happened during what was supposed to be a relaxing camping trip in Botswana. My friends and I had been planning this trip to Kauai for months. We were all experienced campers and nature enthusiasts, but none of us had ever been to this remote part of Botswana before. We were excited to see the incredible wildlife and landscapes that the area was famous for. When we arrived at the campsite, the ranger gave us the usual safety briefing. Most of it was pretty standard stuff. Don't leave food out, be aware of predators, that sort of thing. But there was one warning that stood out. Absolutely no citrus fruits allowed in the camp. Apparently, the smell attracts elephants from miles away. We all nodded along, but I'll admit I didn't take it as seriously as I should have. I mean, how much damage could an elephant really do? That night, we set up our rooftop tent on top of our 4x4 and settled in for what we thought would be a peaceful evening under the stars. I remember drifting off to sleep, feeling so content and at one with nature. If only I knew what was coming. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I was jolted awake by an earth-shaking rumble. At first, in my groggy state, I thought it was thunder. But then I felt the entire vehicle start to rock violently. That's when I heard the trumpeting, a sound so loud and primal it made my blood run cold. I scrambled to unzip the tent flap and poked my head out. What I saw nearly made my heart stop. There, looming over our campsite, was the largest elephant I had ever seen. Its tusks gleamed in the moonlight as it swung its trunk, searching for something. That's when I remembered, oh God, the oranges, in my backpack, right there in the tent with us. Before I could even think about what to do, the elephant let out another deafening trumpet and slammed its trunk against our vehicle. The whole thing shook like it was about to tip over. I could hear my friends in the tent next to us screaming. I was frozen in terror, clinging to the tent poles as the elephant continued to ram the vehicle. With each impact, I was sure the tent was going to collapse or the car would flip. The sound of metal crunching and glass shattering filled the air. Suddenly, there was a loud ripping sound, and I felt a rush of cool night air. The elephant had torn a massive hole in the side of our tent. Its trunk was now inside, frantically searching. I pressed myself as far back as I could, praying it wouldn't find me. The trunk brushed against my leg, and I had to stifle a scream. It was rough and leathery, nothing like I'd imagined. In that moment, I was acutely aware of how small and fragile I was compared to this massive creature. Just then, I heard shouts from across the campsite. Some of the other campers had woken up and were trying to scare the elephant away. They were honking car horns and blasting air cannons. The cacophony was deafening. The elephant seemed startled by the noise and backed away from our tent. But instead of leaving, it just turned its attention to the rest of the camp. I watched in horror as it began tearing through other tents and overturning picnic tables. People were running everywhere in panic. I could hear children crying and women screaming. Someone yelled for everyone to get to the main lodge building for safety, but I was still trapped in my precariously balanced rooftop tent. I knew I had to make a run for it, but the thought of climbing down with that elephant so close paralyzed me with fear. What if it came back as soon as I moved? Just then, I heard the engine of a vehicle roar to life. Through the hole in the tent, I saw the headlights of a ranger's truck speeding towards us. The elephant turned towards the approaching vehicle, giving me the chance I needed. I practically threw myself out of the tent, not even bothering with the ladder. I hit the ground hard and scrambled to my feet, adrenaline masking any pain. I ran as fast as I could towards the lodge, not daring to look back. As I ran, I could hear the ranger honking and revving the engine, trying to herd the elephant away from the camp. The ground shook with each of the animal's footsteps. I was sure at any moment I would feel its trunk wrap around me and pull me back. I burst through the door of the lodge, gasping for breath. Inside, it was chaos. People were huddled together, many crying or in shock. Children clung to their parents. The air was thick with fear and disbelief. Through the windows, we could see the elephant still rampaging through the campsite. It was systematically destroying everything in its path, searching for more citrus fruits. Tents were shredded, cars dented, and gear was strewn everywhere. The rangers were doing their best to contain the situation, but it was clear they were struggling. This elephant was unlike anything they'd dealt with before. Its determination was terrifying. We huddled in the lodge for what felt like hours, flinching at every crash and trumpet from outside. I kept replaying the moment the elephant's trunk entered our tent, how close I'd come to being crushed or worse. Finally, as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, things quieted down. The head ranger came in to give us an update. The elephant had finally been driven away from the camp, but the destruction it left behind was staggering. As we emerged from the lodge, I was shocked by the scale of the damage. Our campsite looked like it had been hit by a tornado. My rooftop tent was completely destroyed, barely hanging on to the vehicle. Other tents were flattened or torn to shreds. Cars had massive dents and broken windows. Personal belongings were scattered everywhere. But amazingly, miraculously, no one had been seriously hurt. We were all shaken and traumatized, but alive. As we picked through the wreckage, trying to salvage what we could, I found my backpack. It had been torn open, the offending oranges nowhere to be seen. Such a small thing to cause so much destruction. The rangers explained that this particular elephant was known in the area for its aggression and attraction to human foods. They had been trying to relocate it for months, but it kept returning. Our citrus fruits had given it the perfect opportunity to raid the camp. In the light of day, with the immediate danger past, I found myself in awe of the elephant's raw power. The ease with which it had torn through our sturdy equipment was humbling. It was a stark reminder that we were visitors in its territory, not the other way around. As we packed up what remained of our gear and prepared to leave Kauai, I knew this experience would stay with me forever. The sheer terror of that night, the overwhelming feeling of helplessness in the face of such a massive creature, it had changed something in me. I gained a new respect for the wild and the importance of heeding warnings, no matter how small they might seem. Nature is not something to be taken lightly or underestimated. To this day, I can't look at an orange without feeling a chill run down my spine. The sound of an elephant trumpeting on nature documentaries makes my heart race, but I also feel incredibly lucky. Lucky to have survived, and lucky to have gained a newfound appreciation for the awesome power of wildlife. I'll never forget that night in Kauai, when an elephant turned our peaceful camping trip into a waking nightmare. It was a harsh reminder of our place in the natural world, and a lesson I'll carry with me always. I hiked deep into the woods, way off the main trails. As the sun started to set, I found a nice secluded spot to set up my tent. The forest was so peaceful and quiet, nothing but the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I got a small campfire going and was just settling in to enjoy the solitude when I heard voices in the distance. At first, I wasn't too worried. I figured it was probably just some other hikers passing by. But as the voices got closer, I started to get an uneasy feeling. They sounded angry and aggressive. I quickly put out my fire and ducked into my tent, hoping they wouldn't notice me. No such luck. A beam from a flashlight swept across my tent, and I heard a gruff voice bark, "Hey, who's in there?" My heart was pounding as I slowly unzipped the tent and poked my head out. There were 3 men standing there, looking none too pleased to see me. "You're not supposed to be camping here," one of them said. "This is private property. Pack up and get out now." I stammered out an apology, saying I didn't realize and would leave right away. But something about these guys seemed off. They weren't wearing any park ranger uniforms, and their demeanor was more threatening than official. "Just give me a few minutes to pack up and I'll be on my way," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The men exchanged glances. "You've got 10 minutes, the leader growled. "If you're still here after that, there's going to be trouble." They melted back into the darkness, but I could hear them muttering to each other nearby. My hands were shaking as I started stuffing my gear into my backpack. Part of me wanted to just abandon everything and run, but I knew I'd never find my way out of the woods in the dark. As I was taking down my tent, I heard a twig snap right behind me. I whirled around, but there was no one there. More whispers and low chuckles drifted from the trees around me. They were toying with me, trying to scare me. And it was working. I finally got everything packed up and started heading in the direction I thought would take me back to the trail. But after just a few minutes of stumbling through the pitch-black forest, I realized I was hopelessly lost. The voices seemed to be all around me now, getting closer and then fading away again. "Where you going, city boy?" one of them called out mockingly. "The fun's just getting started." Another voice chimed in, "Yeah, we've got some games we like to play with trespassers." I broke into a run, branches whipping at my face as I crashed through the underbrush. I could hear them pursuing me, their laughter echoing through the trees. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like jelly, but sheer terror kept me going. Finally, I spotted a faint glow through the trees, moonlight reflecting off water. I burst out of the forest onto the shore of a small lake. For a moment, I thought I was saved. But then I realized I had trapped myself. There was nowhere left to run. The footsteps and voices were getting closer. In desperation, I fumbled for my phone. To my amazement, I actually had a signal out here. With trembling fingers, I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice was like music to my ears. "Please help me," I gasped out between ragged breaths. "I'm in the state park. There are men chasing me. I think they're going to hurt me." "Sir, can you tell me your exact location?" I don't know," I said, fighting back panic. "I'm by a lake. I got lost in the woods. Please, they're getting closer." Just then, I heard a shout from the tree line. "There he is." "Oh God, they've found me," I told the operator. "Please hurry." "Sir, I've dispatched state police to the park. They should be there soon. Try to stay calm and hidden if you can." I looked around frantically for somewhere to hide, but there was nothing but open beach. The men emerged from the woods, spreading out as they approached me. I could see the gleam of metal. They had weapons. "End of the line, boy," the leader called out. "Time to teach you a lesson about trespassing." I backed up until I was knee-deep in the cold lake water. "The police are on their way," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. "You'd better leave now if you don't want to get arrested." They hesitated, exchanging uncertain looks. "He's bluffing," one of them said. "Ain't no way the cops could get here that fast." But just then, we all heard it. The faint wail of sirens in the distance, getting louder by the second. "Shit!" the leader swore. "Let's get out of here." They melted back into the forest as quickly as they had appeared. I sagged with relief, splashing down into the shallow water. I stayed there, shivering, until I saw the flashing lights of the police cars pulling up to the lake shore. The state troopers were baffled when I told them what happened. They searched the area but found no sign of the men who had chased me. If it wasn't for my mud-covered clothes and wild-eyed terror, I think they might not have believed me at all. To this day, I'm not sure who those men were or what they really wanted. Poachers, meth cookers, just some psychos who got their kicks terrorizing campers. I'll probably never know, but one thing's for sure, I'll never go camping alone in the woods again, and I'll definitely get a permit next time. The experience left me shaken for months. I had nightmares about being chased through dark forests. Every snapping twig or rustling bush made me jump. It took a long time before I felt comfortable going hiking or camping again, even in approved areas with friends. I've tried to rationalize it, tell myself that maybe I overreacted or imagined some of it in my panic. But deep down, I know the danger was real. Those men meant to hurt me, maybe even kill me. If it wasn't for that lucky cell signal and the quick response of the police, who knows what would have happened to me that night. Sometimes I wonder if they're still out there, lurking in the woods and waiting for their next victim. I've searched online for any similar incidents in that area, but haven't found anything concrete. Part of me wants to go back someday, to face my fears and reclaim that sense of peace I used to feel in nature. But a bigger part of me says to stay far away and count myself lucky to have escaped. I guess the lesson here is to always follow the rules when it comes to camping and hiking. Those regulations exist for a reason, to keep people safe, and never take your safety for granted, even in places that seem calm and idyllic. Danger can lurk anywhere, and you never know when a simple trip into the woods might turn into a fight for survival. I still love the outdoors, but I'll never look at a forest the same way again. Every shadow holds potential threats, every snapping twig a warning. The peace and tranquility I once found in nature has been replaced by an underlying current of fear and unease. I suppose that's the price I paid for my reckless decision that night. One moment of poor judgment changed my life forever. So if you're planning a camping trip, learn from my mistake. Get the proper permits, tell people where you're going, and stay in designated areas. The wilderness can be beautiful, but it can also be deadly. Those men may be gone, but the fear they instilled in me will last a lifetime. Be safe out there, and never take your security for granted. You never know what might be waiting for you in the dark. That all changed the day I met him. I was about a month into my journey somewhere in Virginia when I came across another hiker at a campsite. He introduced himself as Mike and said he was a bit lost, having strayed from the main trail. I didn't think much of it at the time. Getting turned around isn't uncommon, especially for less experienced hikers. We chatted for a while as I set up my tent, and I gave him some tips on finding his way back to the AT. He seemed friendly enough, if a bit socially awkward. The next morning, Mike was gone before I woke up. I packed up my gear and continued on my way, not expecting to see him again. But a few days later, at a campsite about 50 miles north, there he was. He gave me the same story about getting lost and needing directions. I found it strange that he'd managed to get so far ahead of me, but maybe he'd hitched a ride or something. Still, a faint alarm bell started ringing in the back of my mind. Over the next couple weeks, I kept running into Mike at different campsites. Each time, he acted like it was our first meeting and gave the same lost hiker spiel. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was doing day hikes from different access points and genuinely kept getting turned around. But the distances between sightings made that seem impossible. I started to feel deeply unsettled, like I was being followed. I began altering my planned route, taking less popular side trails and stealth camping away from designated sites. But somehow, Mike still found me. The fake friendliness was gone now. He'd dropped the act as soon as he saw me, just staring with cold, dead eyes. I was legitimately scared, hiking faster and sleeping less, always looking over my shoulder. One night, about 6 weeks into my hike, I was jolted awake by the sound of my tent zipper. Before I could react, a hand clamped over my mouth, and I felt Mike's weight pinning me down. The stench of alcohol was overwhelming. He started pawing at my clothes, mumbling about how he'd been waiting for this. Pure adrenaline and survival instinct took over. I managed to get my legs up and kicked him hard in the chest, knocking him back. As he stumbled, I grabbed my trekking pole and swung it at his head with all my strength. There was a sickening crack, and he crumpled to the ground. For a moment, I thought I'd killed him. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely dial 911 on my satellite phone. But then I heard him groan and start to stir. Panic gripped me. I knew if he got up, he'd probably kill me. I grabbed some paracord from my pack and managed to drag Mike's semi-conscious body to a nearby tree. I tied him securely, my heart pounding the whole time. Once he was restrained, I grabbed my essentials and ran. I didn't even bother breaking down my tent, just took off into the darkness. After a few miles, I came to a gravel road where Mike's beat-up pickup was parked. A wave of rage washed over me. This psycho had been using his vehicle to stalk me up and down the trail for weeks. Without really thinking, I found a big rock and smashed out his windows and headlights. Then I slashed his tires with my knife for good measure. I hiked through the rest of the night, fueled by fear and adrenaline. When I finally reached a small town the next afternoon, I went straight to the police station. I gave them a full report, including the location where I'd left Mike tied up. They seemed to take it seriously, but I was still terrified he'd somehow get free and come after me again. I abandoned my through-hike plans and caught the first bus I could back to my hometown. For weeks after, I jumped at every sound and barely slept. I kept expecting Mike to show up outside my window or in the grocery store. It's been almost a year now, and as far as I know, Mike was never found. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I'll have a vivid nightmare of his dead-eyed stare or the feel of his weight on top of me, and I know it was all too real. I haven't been able to go hiking since. Just the thought of being alone in the woods makes me break out in a cold sweat. I know rationally that what happened to me was a freak occurrence, that most people on the trail are good. But I can't shake the fear. I've tried therapy, but it's hard to fully convey the terror of those weeks being stalked. How do you explain to someone who wasn't there what it feels like to realize you're being hunted? The way your skin crawls when you see that familiar figure appear at yet another campsite, hundreds of miles from where you last saw him. The bone-deep dread of lying in your tent each night, straining to hear footsteps approaching. Sometimes I find myself obsessively Googling missing persons reports or unidentified remains found along the Appalachian Trail. Part of me hopes to find some closure, to know for sure what became of Mike. But mostly I'm terrified I'll see his face staring back at me from a mugshot or crime scene photo. I know I should feel guilty for leaving him tied to that tree, for destroying his truck and just running away instead of waiting for the police. But honestly, I don't. In that moment, it felt like my only option for survival. And a dark part of me hopes he suffered out there, alone and exposed to the elements. That he felt even a fraction of the fear he inflicted on me. I try to remind myself that I'm safe now, that Mike, wherever he is, can't hurt me anymore. But then I'll catch a glimpse of someone who looks like him on the street, and my heart will start racing. Or I'll wake up in the middle of the night, certain I heard the tent zipper. The rational part of my brain knows the odds of running into Mike again are astronomically low, but the trauma-driven part is always on high alert, convinced he's still out there somewhere, waiting, planning. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. I miss the person I was before all this, the carefree nature lover who found peace and joy in solo wilderness adventures. I want so badly to reclaim that part of myself, to lace up my hiking boots and hit the trail without paralyzing fear. But I don't know how to bridge the gap between who I was and who I am now. For now, I'm trying to take it one day at a time. I've started going on short-day hikes in popular, crowded areas. It's not the same as the solitude I used to crave, but it's a start. I'm slowly rebuilding my confidence and trying to heal. But I don't think I'll ever forget those terrifying weeks on the trail. The way Mike's eyes looked in the moment before he attacked, empty and hungry and inhuman. The sound of my own ragged breathing as I ran through the dark woods, certain death was right behind me. I know millions of people hike the Appalachian Trail without incident, that my experience was a horrific anomaly, but it only takes one monster to shatter your sense of safety forever, to make you question every friendly face you meet on the trail. So if you're planning a long-distance hike, please be careful out there. Trust your instincts. Don't ignore those little alarm bells going off in your head. And maybe think twice before helping that lost hiker who keeps turning up where he shouldn't be. As for me, I'm not sure if I'll ever attempt a through hike again. The trail was my dream for so long, but now it feels tainted. Still, I hold out hope that someday I'll find the courage to return to those misty mountains and reclaim the peace I once found there. To face my fears and prove to myself that I'm stronger than the trauma. But for now, the Appalachian Trail remains a bittersweet memory of beauty and terror, solitude and danger. A reminder that sometimes the scariest monsters aren't supernatural creatures lurking in the dark, but the all-too-human predators hiding behind a mask of normalcy. We headed out to our usual spot on the riverbank just as the sun was setting. The air was crisp, and there was a light fog rolling in off the water. Perfect conditions for night fishing. My older brother Jake brought his new LED lantern, which cast an eerie blue glow around our little campsite. As darkness fell, we settled in with our rods and a cooler of beer, joking around and telling stories like we always did on these trips. Everything felt normal at first. The gentle lapping of the water against the shore, the chirping of crickets, the occasional splash of a fish jumping. It was all so familiar and comforting. But then, around 10 p.m., my younger brother Matt suddenly went quiet mid-sentence. I looked over at him and saw his eyes were fixed on something across the river. Following his gaze, I spotted what had caught his attention. 3 small lights hovering just above the opposite bank. "Hey, you guys see that?" Matt asked, his voice low and tense. Jake and I both nodded silently, transfixed by the strange lights. At first, I assumed it must be other fishermen with flashlights, but as I watched, I realized something wasn't right about the way they were moving. The lights seemed to float and bob in the air, moving in erratic patterns that didn't match how a person would walk along the riverbank. And they were far too close together. 3 people wouldn't bunch up that tightly while navigating in the dark. "What the hell are those things?" Jake muttered, setting down his fishing rod. We watched in stunned silence as the lights danced and weaved through the air, sometimes separating slightly before clustering back together. They gave off a soft, yellowish glow that didn't seem quite bright enough to be flashlights or lanterns. After a few minutes, Matt stood up. "I'm going to try to get a better look," he said, grabbing Jake's lantern. Jake and I exchanged an uneasy glance, but followed him down to the water's edge. As we got closer, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck start to stand up. Something about those lights just felt wrong. When we reached the shore, Matt shone the lantern out across the water. The beam cut through the mist, illuminating the far bank. But to our shock, the 3 lights were gone. "Where'd they go?" I whispered, scanning the tree line. Just as the words left my mouth, the lights suddenly reappeared, but now they were hovering directly above us, at least 15 feet in the air. I let out a startled yelp and stumbled backwards. Matt dropped the lantern, plunging us into darkness. In that instant of blindness, I felt a rush of cold air and heard a faint humming sound. When my eyes adjusted, I looked up to see the lights had moved again. They were now arranged in a perfect triangle, pulsing gently as they hovered over the middle of the river. "Holy shit," Jake breathed. "What are we seeing right now?" Before anyone could answer, the lights abruptly shot straight up into the sky at an impossible speed. They paused for a split second at the apex of their ascent, then zipped off in 3 different directions, vanishing into the night in the blink of an eye. The 3 of us stood there in stunned silence for what felt like an eternity. My heart was pounding and my mind was reeling, unable to process what I'd just witnessed. Finally, Matt broke the silence. Did that really just happen?" he asked shakily. Jake and I could only nod mutely. We were all rattled to our core. We spent the next hour scouring the opposite bank with our flashlights, searching for any sign of what could have produced those lights. But we found nothing, no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no equipment left behind. It was as if the lights had never existed at all. Eventually, we packed up our gear and headed home. None of us felt much like fishing anymore. The drive back was tense and quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. In the days and weeks that followed, we talked about that night constantly. We went over every detail, trying to come up with some rational explanation for what we'd seen, but nothing made sense. The movements were too precise and coordinated to be fireflies or other insects. The sudden appearances and disappearances ruled out any kind of aircraft or drone, and the way they had instantly transported from one location to another defied the laws of physics as we understood them. We even went back to that spot on the river several times, hoping to see the lights again or find some clue we'd missed. But there was never anything out of the ordinary. To this day, I still don't know what those lights were or where they came from. The memory of that night haunts me. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see those eerie glowing orbs dancing above the dark water. I've read about similar sightings of unexplained lights, will-o'-the-wisps, ghost lights, UFOs, but nothing quite matches what we experienced. It was like something straight out of the Twilight Zone. Part of me wishes I could just write it off as a shared hallucination or some kind of natural phenomenon we didn't understand. But deep down, I know what I saw. Those lights were real, and they were not of this world. I've become obsessed with trying to find an answer. I've spent countless hours researching similar incidents, reaching out to experts, even exploring fringe theories about interdimensional beings. But I'm no closer to the truth now than I was that night on the river. The experience has changed me. I find myself looking at the night sky differently now, wondering what other mysteries might be out there just beyond our perception. I've become more open-minded about the unexplained, more willing to consider possibilities outside of our current scientific understanding. But it's also left me with a deep sense of unease. If those lights were some kind of intelligent entities, what were their intentions? Why did they appear to us? And most unsettling of all, are they still out there, watching us even now? I know this all probably sounds crazy. If someone had told me this story before that night, I would have laughed it off as an obvious hoax or the ramblings of a drunk fisherman. But I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. And no matter how much time passes, I can't shake the memory of those impossible lights dancing above the river. Sometimes I wish I could just forget about it and move on with my life. But I know that's impossible. That night changed everything for me. It opened my eyes to a reality beyond what I thought I knew. And now, I can't help but wonder, what else might be out there, just waiting to be discovered? I still go fishing with my brothers sometimes, but it's different now. We're always on edge, scanning the darkness for any sign of those mysterious lights. And even though we've never seen them again, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there somewhere, watching and waiting. So I'm sharing my story here, hoping that maybe someone else has had a similar experience, or that someone out there might have some insight into what we saw that night. Because until I find some answers, I don't think I'll ever truly be able to rest easy again. If you're ever out on a river at night and you see strange lights in the sky, don't assume they're just fireflies or satellites. Keep your wits about you and remember, there are things in this world that defy explanation. And sometimes those things find us when we least expect it. Arrived at the park late in the afternoon and hiked a few miles in, looking for the perfect secluded spot to set up camp. As the sun started to set, I found a nice clearing surrounded by towering redwoods. I quickly got to work setting up my tent and unpacking my gear. The peace and quiet of the forest was exactly what I needed. As darkness fell, I got a small campfire going and sat back to enjoy the stars peeking through the canopy above. The crackling of the fire and chirping of crickets were the only sounds. I felt totally alone, in a good way, or so I thought. Around 10 p.m. I started hearing some strange noises coming from the woods around my campsite. At first I tried to brush it off as just normal forest sounds, but something about it unsettled me. It sounded almost like whispers or low talking. A chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, a beam of light cut through the darkness, scanning over my campsite. I froze, my heart pounding. A gruff voice called out, "Hey, this area's off limits for camping. You need to pack up and clear out." I stammered out a response, claiming I didn't know and apologizing. But the voice just repeated more forcefully that I needed to leave immediately. I reluctantly started packing up my gear, but something about the whole situation felt very off. Why would a park ranger be out here so late? And why did it sound like there were multiple people? As I was taking down my tent, I heard hushed voices and snickering coming from the darkness. More flashlight beams danced around the edges of my campsite. I realized with growing dread that this wasn't any official park personnel. I was being surrounded by a group of strangers with unknown intentions. My hands shook as I tried to quickly shove my camping gear into my backpack. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cool night air. I needed to get out of there fast. Just then, one of the voices called out in a taunting tone, "Hey, that's a nice tent you got there. Bet it was expensive. Mind if we take a closer look?" Another chimed in, "Yeah, and check out that fancy camping stove. We could use one of those." My blood ran cold. These people were clearly sizing up my belongings. I knew I was in serious danger. Heart racing, I grabbed my pack and made to leave the campsite. But as soon as I stepped towards the trail, flashlights converged on me from all sides. I was surrounded. A figure emerged from the shadows, a large man with a wild beard and glinting eyes. He grinned menacingly and said, "Where you running off to, city boy? The fun's just getting started." Panic gripped me. I blurted out, "Please, just take whatever you want. I won't cause any trouble." The bearded man chuckled darkly. "Oh, we'll take what we want, all right. But first, we're going to have us some entertainment." The group closed in around me, laughing and jeering. I could make out at least 5 or 6 figures in the flickering firelight. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out of this nightmare. Suddenly, an idea struck me. I took a deep breath and said as calmly as I could, "My mom is expecting me to check in. If I don't call her soon, she'll get worried and alert the authorities." The bearded man's eyes narrowed. "Is that so? Well, go ahead and make your call then. Wouldn't want Mommy to worry." With trembling hands, I pulled out my phone. To my immense relief, I had a bar of cell service. I quickly dialed my mom, praying she would pick up. After 2 agonizing rings, I heard her voice. "Hello?" Trying to keep my voice steady, I said, "Hey, Mom, just checking in like I promised. Having a great time camping in Redwood State Park. Talk to you tomorrow." I hung up, hoping I had done enough to alert her that something was wrong without tipping off my captors. The bearded man nodded approvingly, but I could see suspicion in his eyes. For the next hour, the group of strangers tormented me. They circled my campsite, making strange animal noises and whispering threats just out of sight. They'd occasionally dart in to rifle through my belongings or shove me around. I was paralyzed with fear, unsure of what they planned to do with me. Just when I thought I couldn't take the psychological torture any longer, I heard the most beautiful sound, distant sirens. The group instantly tensed up. "Shit, it's the cops," one of them hissed. The bearded man turned to me with fury in his eyes. "You little bastard! You called them, didn't you?" Before I could respond, they all took off running into the woods. Within seconds, they had vanished into the darkness, leaving me alone and shaking. A few minutes later, 2 state troopers came crashing through the underbrush, flashlights blazing. They quickly assessed the situation, and I broke down, sobbing with relief as I recounted my harrowing experience. It turns out my mom had sensed something was off in my voice and called the park rangers, who then alerted state police. They had mobilized quickly, likely saving me from who knows what horrible fate. The troopers searched the area, but found no trace of the group that had terrorized me. They escorted me back to my car, and I got the hell out of there, driving straight home in a daze. It's been weeks since that night, but I still have trouble sleeping. Every little noise makes me jump. I can't shake the feeling of helplessness and terror I felt surrounded by those twisted strangers in the dark woods. I don't know who they were or what they ultimately planned to do to me. Were they just some local psychos who got their kicks terrorizing campers? Or something even more sinister? I'll probably never know. All I know is that I'm never going camping alone again. The wilderness holds beauty, but it can also conceal true evil. I learned that the hard way on that terrifying night in Redwood State Park. The first day had gone smoothly. We'd hiked in, set up camp, and spent the afternoon teaching the kids basic winter survival skills. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire for dinner and ghost stories. The boys were excited but nervous about sleeping outdoors in the cold. I reassured them, explaining our safety protocols and reminding them that experienced guides would be on watch all night. Around midnight, I settled into my sleeping bag for a few hours of rest before my 3 a.m. watch shift. I had just started to doze off when I felt someone shaking my shoulder urgently. "Mr. Johnson! Mr. Johnson, wake up!" It was Tommy, one of the younger scouts, his voice trembling with fear. I sat up groggily. "What's wrong, Tommy?" "There's a man by the fire," he whispered. "I saw him when I got up to pee. He was just standing there staring at our tents." I frowned, instantly alert. We were miles from the nearest road or town. "Are you sure it wasn't one of the other guides?" Tommy shook his head vigorously. "No, sir. I know what they look like. This was a stranger. Tall guy in a red plaid shirt. Please, can you come look?" I grabbed my coat and flashlight, heart pounding as I unzipped the tent. The campsite was silent and still, bathed in pale moonlight. A light snow was falling. I scanned the area around the dimly glowing embers of our fire, but saw no sign of any intruder. "I don't see anyone, Tommy," I said gently. "Are you sure you weren't dreaming?" "I swear I saw him," the boy insisted, but he looked uncertain now. I did a quick sweep of the perimeter just to be safe, but found nothing amiss. The snow was undisturbed except for our own tracks from earlier. I checked on the other tents. Everyone else was sound asleep. "Try to get some rest," I told Tommy as I tucked him back into his sleeping bag. "I'll keep an extra close watch tonight, okay?" He nodded, still looking shaken. I stayed up for a while, watching the campsite, but saw nothing unusual. Eventually I dozed off again, chalking it up to an overactive imagination. A few hours later, my watch alarm woke me for my shift. I pulled on my boots and coat and stepped out into the frigid night air. The snow had stopped, and the sky was clear now, a dazzling canopy of stars overhead. I made my rounds, checking on each tent. All was quiet. I was about halfway through my shift when I decided to walk the short trail down to the creek to refill our water jugs. The creek was only about 50 yards from camp, but the path wound through some dense pines. As I neared the water, the trees opened up into a small clearing. That's when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, half hidden behind a large pine. Tall and lean, wearing a red and black plaid shirt, just like Tommy had described. In the bright moonlight, I could make out his face clearly. Gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow faintly. He was staring directly at me, completely motionless. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air ran down my spine. Then I remembered my flashlight. I fumbled to turn it on, my hands shaking. The beam cut through the darkness, and he was gone. Just like that. 1 second he was there. The next, he had vanished into thin air. I swept the light around wildly, my heart pounding, but there was no sign of him. I sprinted back to camp, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? But no, I had seen him as clearly as I'm seeing this screen now. I burst into the other senior guide's tent, waking him up. Together, we searched the entire area, but found nothing. No tracks in the snow, no broken branches, nothing. We woke the junior guides and had them help us do a head count. All the boys were accounted for. We debated whether to break camp and hike out early, but decided it would be more dangerous to travel through the wilderness at night. We doubled the watch instead, with 2 of us on duty at all times until dawn. Nothing else happened that night, or for the rest of the trip. We hiked out the next day as planned. I wanted to tell the boys it had all been a misunderstanding, just to reassure them. But I couldn't bring myself to lie. The few who asked, I just told we had taken extra precautions as a safety measure, but that everything was fine. I've been on dozens of camping trips since then, but I've never experienced anything like it again. I've gone over it in my mind countless times, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Could it have been another hiker somehow? But there were no tracks, and no one could have disappeared that quickly. A hallucination brought on by altitude and fatigue? But Tommy saw him too. To this day, I have no idea who or what that figure in the red plaid shirt was. But sometimes, on cold winter nights when the moon is full, I still find myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. At first, everything was peaceful. The forest was lush and green, birds were chirping, and I was enjoying the solitude. But as I hiked deeper into the woods, An uneasy feeling started to creep over me. The trail seemed to be getting narrower and more overgrown with each step. The trees pressed in closer, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. I tried to shake off my growing anxiety, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But I couldn't stop thinking about the stories I'd heard about this area, the Bennington Triangle. People had gone missing here over the years, hunters, college students, hikers. No one knew what happened to them. They just vanished without a trace. As the afternoon wore on, the forest grew darker and more oppressive. The cheerful bird songs faded away, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the crunching of leaves under my boots. I picked up my pace, eager to reach the campsite I was aiming for before nightfall. But the faster I walked, the more turned around I felt. Panic started to set in as I realized I might be lost. I pulled out my map and compass, but they seemed useless in the dense woods. Every tree looked the same. Every path led nowhere. My heart was pounding as I spun in circles trying to get my bearings. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl coming from the underbrush. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, closer this time. Something was out there, stalking me. I took off running blindly through the forest, branches whipping at my face. I could hear heavy footsteps pursuing me, getting closer and closer. My lungs were burning, but I didn't dare slow down. In my panic, I lost my footing on some loose rocks and went tumbling down a steep slope. I hit the ground hard. The wind knocked out of me. For a moment, I just lay there gasping, waiting to feel sharp claws or teeth. But there was only silence. I slowly sat up, looking around wildly. Whatever had been chasing me seemed to be gone. As my breathing slowed, I realized I was in a small clearing. To my immense relief, I spotted a dilapidated old cabin about 50 yards away. I limped over to it as quickly as I could, praying it would provide some shelter for the night. The cabin was clearly abandoned, with broken windows and a sagging roof. But the door was intact, and I gratefully ducked inside, slamming it shut behind me. I used my flashlight to scan the dusty interior. There wasn't much, just some old furniture and debris. But it was shelter, and that's all that mattered. I barricaded the door as best I could with a heavy wooden table. Then I set about gathering what I could to start a fire in the old stone fireplace. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely strike the matches, but I finally got a small blaze going. As night fell outside, I huddled close to the fire, jumping at every little sound. My mind kept replaying that growl I'd heard in the woods. What kind of animal had been stalking me? A bear? A mountain lion? Or was it something else? I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't natural. Sleep was out of the question. I was terrified that if I dozed off, I'd wake up to find some monstrous creature looming over me. So I kept the fire burning all night, feeding it with broken furniture and old newspapers I found scattered around. Every creak of the old cabin made me flinch. Shadows danced on the walls, taking on sinister shapes. More than once I could have sworn I saw glowing eyes peering in through the broken windows. But when I shone my flashlight, there was nothing there. As the night dragged on, my fear and exhaustion made me start to question my own senses. Had I really heard something chasing me earlier? Or had it all been in my imagination? I tried to rationalize it. I was just an inexperienced hiker who'd gotten spooked by some normal forest sounds. There was no monster out there, no sinister force making people disappear. But then why did I still feel like I was being watched? Why did the shadows seem to move of their own accord? Why did the air feel so thick and oppressive, like something malevolent was pressing in all around me? When the first rays of dawn finally started to lighten the sky, I nearly wept with relief. I'd made it through the night. As soon as it was light enough, I grabbed my pack and got the hell out of there. I didn't even care which direction I went, as long as it was away from that forest. By some miracle, I stumbled across a hiking trail after a couple hours of frantic walking. I followed it until I reached a ranger station, where I was able to get help and directions back to civilization. I've tried to convince myself that it was all just a case of an overactive imagination combined with getting lost in unfamiliar territory. But deep down, I know something truly strange and terrifying happened to me out there. I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted by something inhuman, or the oppressive darkness of that night in the cabin, certain that at any moment something was going to come for me. Whatever is going on in those woods, I hope they figure it out soon, because I have a sickening feeling that if they don't, more people are going to disappear without a trace. And next time, there might not be an old cabin to provide shelter from the horrors lurking in the forest. I know one thing for certain. I'm never setting foot in those mountains again. Some places are better left unexplored, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. I still can't believe what happened during our camping trip to Palmetto Island last summer. It was supposed to be a fun family getaway, but it turned into the most terrifying day of my life. We had been looking forward to this trip for months. My wife and I wanted to get our 9-year-old son, Jake, away from video games and into nature for a bit. Palmetto Island seemed perfect, a beautiful resort surrounded by lush forests and hiking trails. We arrived on a Friday afternoon and set up our campsite. Jake was buzzing with excitement, begging to go explore. We decided to check out the playground first to let him burn off some energy after the long drive. The playground was impressive, with all sorts of climbing structures and slides. Jake made friends with some other kids right away, and they were soon running around playing tag. My wife and I sat on a nearby bench, enjoying the warm sunshine and feeling relaxed for the first time in ages. After about an hour, we called Jake over and said it was time to head back to set up the rest of our campsite before dinner. He begged for just 5 more minutes of play. Against my better judgment, I agreed. My wife and I started slowly packing up our things, keeping an eye on Jake from afar. But when we looked up again just a few minutes later, Jake was nowhere to be seen. We scanned the playground, checked behind all the equipment, called his name. Nothing. A knot of dread formed in my stomach as I realized he must have wandered off. We split up to search, my wife heading towards the nearby cabins, while I ran towards the trails leading into the woods. I was calling Jake's name frantically, my heart pounding. How could he have disappeared so quickly? The dense trees suddenly felt ominous and threatening. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes, I heard Jake's voice in the distance. Relief flooded through me until I realized he wasn't alone. As I got closer, I saw Jake talking to a group of adults I didn't recognize. They were gathered around a beaten-up old van parked on a service road. Jake looked confused and scared. One of the men had his hand on Jake's shoulder in what looked like a comforting gesture, but something about it made my skin crawl. As I got within earshot, I heard Jake say, "I think our campsite number was 127? My blood ran cold. Our site was actually number 52. Jake was lying about our location. Before I could call out, the man patted Jake on the back and said, "No problem, buddy. Hop in and we'll give you a ride back." He started guiding Jake towards the van door. In that moment, time seemed to stand still. I knew with absolute certainty that if Jake got in that van, I'd never see him again. A primal animal fear gripped me. I opened my mouth to yell, but no sound came out. Just then, by some miracle, I heard the whir of an electric motor. A golf cart came puttering down the path, driven by another camper. Without thinking, I leaped in front of it, waving my arms frantically. The driver slammed on the brakes, looking alarmed. "Please," I gasped. "My son, those men." I pointed towards the van. The driver took one look at my face and nodded grimly. He gunned the little cart forward as I clung to the side. We burst out of the trees just as the man was opening the van door for Jake. I screamed Jake's name and he turned, his eyes widening in recognition and relief. The man's friendly demeanor vanished instantly. He shoved Jake roughly away from the van and leaped into the driver's seat. I jumped off the golf cart and scooped Jake into my arms, holding him tight as the van peeled away down the dirt road. The golf cart driver was already on his phone with the police, rattling off details about the van and the men inside. Jake was sobbing, clinging to me. "I'm sorry, Daddy," he kept saying. "I got lost and they said they'd help me." I shushed him, tears running down my own face as the adrenaline began to fade. The next few hours were a blur. Police swarmed the campground. We gave statements, looked at mug shots. Jake was checked out by paramedics. My wife arrived, having been alerted by other campers. We held each other and cried. It wasn't until much later that night, after Jake had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep, that we learned the full story. The police had managed to track down and arrest the men in the van a few miles away. It turned out they were a family, a father, 2 adult sons, and an uncle. And they had a long history of similar crimes. They would target family campgrounds, looking for children who wandered off alone. Sometimes they posed as campground staff, offering kids rides back to their sites. Other times they'd claim to be fellow campers who were lost and ask kids for help finding their way. They had perfected the act of seeming friendly and trustworthy, and they had gotten away with it for years. There were warrants out for their arrest in 3 different states, but they kept moving, changing their appearance, using different vehicles, until that day on Palmetto Island when their luck finally ran out. I still get chills thinking about how close we came to losing Jake forever. If that golf cart hadn't come along at that exact moment, I don't even want to imagine. The police told us that in most of their previous abductions, the children were never seen again. We didn't sleep much that night, or for many nights after. Jake had nightmares for months. We all went to therapy. It took a long time before any of us felt safe again, especially outdoors or in crowded places. But slowly, we've started to heal. Jake is 12 now and thriving. He's more cautious than he used to be, but he's regained his love of nature and adventure. We still go camping sometimes, but never without taking extensive safety precautions. I know we were incredibly lucky that day. So many little things had to align perfectly for Jake to be saved. The golf cart, the alert driver, the police responding so quickly. I'm grateful every single day that we got our happy ending when so many other families haven't been as fortunate. But I'll never forget the terror of those moments when I thought I'd lost my son forever. It's a parent's worst nightmare, and we came so close to living it. I still wake up sometimes in a cold sweat, seeing that van door closing with Jake inside. If there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's to trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't worry about seeming rude or paranoid. Your child's safety is more important than anything else. And please, teach your kids about stranger danger early and often. It could save their lives one day. I'm just so thankful that our story had a happy ending. But I know we'll all carry the scars of that day with us forever. Whenever I see a white van now, my heart starts racing. Whenever Jake is out of my sight for more than a minute, panic sets in. I don't think that will ever fully go away. But we're still here. We're still a family. And we cherish every moment together, knowing how close we came to losing it all on what should have been a carefree summer day at Palmetto Island. I've never been so terrified in my life. It happened last summer at the Sunburst Music Festival. I'm 21, and it was only my second time at a big festival like that. My friends and I were so excited. We'd been planning the trip for months, picking out our outfits, making playlists of all the artists we wanted to see. The first day was amazing. The music, the energy of the crowd, the whole vibe. I felt so alive and free. That night, my friend Jess convinced me to try acid for the first time. I was nervous, but also curious. She said it would make the music sound incredible. At first it was fun. Colors seemed brighter. The music washed over me in waves. But then things started to get weird. The crowd felt oppressive, closing in on me. Faces looked distorted and menacing. I started to panic, my heart racing. I told Jess I needed to get out of there, but when I turned around, she was gone. I couldn't find any of my friends in the sea of people. I stumbled away from the main stage area, disoriented and scared. Everything was a blur of lights and noise. I had no idea where I was or how to get back to our campsite. The acid was hitting me hard, and I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. That's when these two guys approached me. They seemed friendly at first, asking if I was okay. I must have looked a mess, sweaty, wide-eyed, clearly freaking out. They said they had a trailer nearby where I could chill out and come down. In my altered state, it seemed like a good idea. I just wanted to escape the chaos. They led me away from the festival grounds to a more secluded area with RVs and trailers. Alarm bells started going off in my head, but I felt paralyzed, unable to resist, as they guided me inside a beat-up old Airstream. As soon as the door closed behind us, their demeanor changed completely. One of them shoved me down onto a dingy mattress, while the other one started pawing at my clothes. I screamed, but the music from the festival drowned it out. They were laughing, telling me to relax, that I'd enjoy it. Pure terror and adrenaline coursed through me. Somehow I managed to knee one of them in the groin and make a run for the door. I burst out of the trailer and just ran blindly into the darkness. I could hear them shouting and coming after me. I plunged into a thicket of thorny bushes, the branches tearing at my skin and clothes. But I didn't care. I just had to get away. I ran until my lungs were on fire, crashing through the undergrowth. Finally, I couldn't hear them behind me anymore. I emerged on the other side of the thicket, scratched and bleeding. I had no idea where I was. It was pitch black, except for the faint glow of the festival in the distance. I was sobbing uncontrollably, still tripping hard. The trees seemed to loom over me menacingly. Every rustle and snap of a twig made me jump. I wandered aimlessly for what felt like hours, terrified those men would find me. The acid was wearing off, but I still felt disconnected from reality. Eventually, I saw some tents and stumbled towards them, praying I'd find help. An older couple was sitting by a campfire. When they saw the state I was in, they immediately got me a blanket and some water. The woman held me while I cried, telling me I was safe now. They wanted to call the police, but I begged them not to. I was scared of getting in trouble and just wanted to forget the whole thing. They let me stay with them until morning, when I was sober enough to find my way back to my friend's campsite. I made up a story about getting lost and spending the night with some girls I met. I was too ashamed and traumatized to tell anyone what really happened. The rest of the festival was a blur. I felt like a shell of myself, jumping at every sound, unable to enjoy anything. My friends couldn't understand why I was acting so weird. I just wanted to go home. It's been almost a year, and I still have nightmares about that night. I've never told anyone the full story until now. Writing this out is bringing it all back. My hands are shaking. I used to be so trusting and carefree. Now I'm constantly on edge, especially around men I don't know. I haven't been to any concerts or festivals since then. The thought of being in a big crowd makes me panic. I know I made a huge mistake taking that acid and going off with strangers. I replay that night over and over, thinking of all the ways it could have ended even worse. I'm grateful I escaped, but I feel like a part of me was left behind in that trailer. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. To anyone reading this, please be careful out there. Watch out for your friends and trust your instincts. I never thought something like this could happen to me, but it did. I'm still trying to make sense of it all and heal. Some days are better than others. I hope that by sharing my story, maybe I can prevent someone else from going through what I did. Stay safe out there. My mom married Ron when I was 15. He seemed like a nice enough guy, kind of quiet, but good to my mom. He had 2 kids from a previous marriage, and within a year, they had my half-sister Polly together. We all moved into this big old house in the suburbs. It wasn't anything special, just your typical 1970s split level, but it had enough room for our newly blended family. Everything was normal for the first couple years. Sure, there were the usual growing pains of a blended family, but nothing major. Then, out of nowhere, Ron committed suicide. No warning signs, no note, nothing. It devastated all of us, especially my mom and little Polly, who was only 3 at the time. That's when things started getting weird. At first, it was just little stuff that was easy to brush off. Items would go missing and then turn up in strange places. We'd hear footsteps upstairs when everyone was downstairs. The dog would growl at empty corners of rooms. I tried to rationalize it all. Grief does strange things to your mind, right? But then it escalated. One night, I woke up to the sound of Polly's musical toy box playing in the middle of the night. When I went to check on her, the box was in the middle of her floor, lid open, slowly turning. Polly was sound asleep. I quickly shut it and put it away, telling myself it must have just wound itself up somehow. A few nights later, my mom came running into my room, white as a sheet. She swore she'd seen a tall, dark figure standing at the foot of her bed. When she turned on the light, it was gone. I comforted her, saying it was probably just a dream, but inside, I was terrified. The incidents kept piling up. My stepdad's kids refused to sleep in their rooms, saying they felt like someone was watching them. Objects would move on their own. We'd put something down and turn around to find it in a completely different spot. The house always felt cold, even in the middle of summer with the AC off. But the worst was what started happening with Polly. She began talking about bad kids in the basement. She'd have screaming fits if we tried to take her down there to do laundry. One day, I found her sitting in the corner of the living room, rocking back and forth and muttering to herself. When I asked her what was wrong, she looked at me with this vacant expression and said, "Daddy's angry." It chilled me to the bone. We tried to ignore it, to pretend everything was fine. But it just kept getting worse. One night, we were all woken up by a huge crash. We ran downstairs to find every single kitchen cabinet flung open, dishes shattered all over the floor. As we stood there in shock, we heard this low, guttural growl coming from the basement. That was the last straw for my mom. She called a priest the next day. Father Mike came to bless the house. He seemed skeptical at first, but as he was sprinkling holy water in Polly's room, one of her dolls suddenly flew off the shelf, and hit him in the back. His face went pale, and he started praying more fervently. He told us he sensed a dark presence and that we should consider moving. But we couldn't afford to move. So we reached out to some paranormal investigators. They came with all their equipment, EMF meters, infrared cameras, the works. They picked up some weird readings, especially in the basement and Polly's room. But the creepiest thing was when they were reviewing their audio recordings. In the background of one of the tapes, barely audible, was a man's voice saying, "My family." The lead investigator, a woman named Carol, sat us down and told us she believed we were dealing with a demonic entity. She said it had likely attached itself to Ron before his death and was now trying to claim his family as its own. The thought made me sick to my stomach. Carol and her team performed a cleansing ritual on the house. They burned sage, said prayers, and placed blessed crosses in the most active areas. For a while, it seemed to work. The activity died down, and we started to feel normal again. But then, about a month later, it all came roaring back. It was like whatever was in our house was angry that we'd tried to get rid of it. The activity was more violent than ever. Doors would slam so hard the walls shook. We'd hear horrific screaming coming from empty rooms. Polly started having night terrors, waking up screaming about a bad man trying to take her away. One night, I woke up to find Polly standing at the foot of my bed, her eyes wide and glassy. In a voice that didn't sound like her own, she said, "He's coming for us all." Then she collapsed. When she woke up the next morning, she had no memory of it. We were at our wits' end. We couldn't live like this anymore. In desperation, we reached out to a different priest, one who specialized in exorcisms. Father James came to our house and spent hours praying and performing rituals. The whole time, the house was in chaos. Objects flying around, lights flickering, that awful growling sound coming from everywhere and nowhere. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, everything went quiet. The oppressive feeling that had hung over the house for months lifted. Father James told us he believed he had successfully banished the entity, but warned us to stay vigilant. It's been 5 years now, and we haven't experienced anything since that night. We still keep blessed crosses in every room, just in case. Polly, now 8, doesn't remember any of it, thank God. The rest of us, though, will never forget. I still don't know what to make of it all. Was it really Ron's spirit, some demon that latched onto our grief? Or were we all just losing our minds? I don't have any answers. All I know is that for months, our house was a living nightmare, and I wouldn't wish that experience on anyone. Sometimes late at night, I still find myself listening for footsteps or checking the corners of rooms. I guess some fears never really leave you. If you've made it this far, thanks for reading. I needed to get this off my chest. And if you ever experience anything like this, don't wait. Get help immediately. No one should have to live in fear in their own home. The previous owner was a sweet, elderly man named Harold, who had lived there for decades, caring for his ailing wife until she passed. He seemed sad to leave, but said it was time to move to assisted living. We thought we'd found the perfect starter home to build our future. Those first few days were a whirlwind of unpacking boxes and settling in. Everything seemed normal at first. But on our third night there, I woke up suddenly around 3 a.m. The house was dead silent, but I had the overwhelming feeling that someone was watching me. I nudged Tom awake, whispering that I heard something. He groggily told me it was probably just the house settling and went back to sleep. I lay there for what felt like hours, every muscle tense, straining to hear any sound. Just as I was starting to relax, I heard it, the unmistakable creak of footsteps in the hallway outside our bedroom. My breath caught in my throat. We were on the second floor, and I knew Tom and I were the only ones home. I shook Tom awake again, hissing that someone was in the house. This time he sat up, listening intently. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, pacing up and down the hall. Tom grabbed the baseball bat we kept by the bed and crept to the door. I cowered under the covers, my heart pounding. He flung open the door and flipped on the lights, bat raised. But the hallway was empty. We searched the entire house but found no sign of an intruder. All the doors and windows were still locked. Tom tried to reassure me it was just old pipes or the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The next morning, I noticed things slightly out of place. A chair moved, picture frames crooked. Tom said I was being paranoid, but I knew I hadn't imagined those footsteps. Things escalated quickly after that first night. Objects would disappear and reappear in odd places. I'd put my keys on the coffee table, turn around for a second, and they'd be gone, only to show up hours later in a kitchen drawer. The TV and lights would turn on by themselves in empty rooms. One afternoon, I was home alone doing laundry in the basement. I heard slow, shuffling footsteps directly above me, like someone dragging their feet across the kitchen floor. My blood ran cold. I knew no one else was home. I forced myself to go upstairs and check, but of course the house was empty. As I stood there trying to calm my racing heart, all the kitchen cabinets suddenly flew open at once with a thunderous bang. I ran out of the house and didn't return until Tom got home from work. He still tried to explain it all away. An old house settling, forgetfulness, drafts. But even he couldn't deny it when we both witnessed the dining room chairs sliding across the floor on their own one evening. We just stared in shocked silence, unable to process what we were seeing. The activity seemed to intensify at night. We'd hear disembodied whispers and labored breathing in dark corners of rooms. Sometimes I'd wake up feeling an oppressive weight on my chest, unable to move or breathe. One night I jolted awake to see a dark figure looming over our bed, but it vanished when I screamed. Our cat Whiskers was the first casualty. We found her stiff body at the foot of the stairs that first week, no apparent cause of death. The vet was baffled. I was devastated. Whiskers had been with me for 12 years and was in perfect health. Looking back, I think she sensed the evil in that house, and it was too much for her. As Halloween approached, things took an even stranger turn. I put up some decorations, nothing too elaborate, just a few pumpkins and a plastic skeleton. But every morning, I'd come downstairs to find everything rearranged. The skeleton posed in different positions, pumpkins clustered together when I'd spread them out. I started to dread seeing what new configurations I'd find each day. The week before Halloween, I was in the kitchen and heard a rustling behind me. I turned to see the plastic skeleton animate before my eyes, its jaw chattering and limbs twitching. I screamed and ran from the room. When Tom came to investigate, it was motionless again. He accused me of playing a prank, but the terror in my eyes convinced him otherwise. That night, we heard what sounded like a Halloween party in full swing downstairs, music playing, laughter, the clink of glasses. But when we went to check, the house was silent and empty. As soon as we got back in bed, the phantom party started up again. This went on for hours, driving us to the brink of madness. November brought a brief lull in activity. We started to hope maybe whatever was haunting us had moved on. How wrong we were. The calm was shattered the day after Thanksgiving, when I was putting up Christmas decorations. I had just finished arranging our nativity scene on the mantel when the phone rang. I spoke to my mom for maybe 10 minutes. When I returned, the entire nativity scene had been completely rearranged. Mary and Joseph separated, the wise men clustered around baby Jesus, the animals lined up in size order. I called for Tom in a shaky voice. He came running and stopped short when he saw it. "What the hell?" he muttered. As we stood there gaping, one of the wise men figures slowly toppled over on its own. We looked at each other in horror and fled the room. That was the final straw for Tom. He'd been skeptical before, writing off my fears as an overactive imagination. But seeing it with his own eyes shook him to his core. We started researching the house's history, desperate for answers. We learned that Harold, the former owner, had indeed cared for his wife through a long illness before she died. But we also uncovered whispers of something darker, rumors that Harold had kept his wife prisoner in the house for years, never allowing her to leave. Some even suggested he'd hastened her death when caring for her became too burdensome. Armed with this knowledge, the hauntings took on a more sinister tone. Was it Harold's wife, trapped and angry, or Harold himself, unable to let go of his home? The next few weeks were a blur of terror. Objects flying across rooms, disembodied screams in the night, shadowy figures darting just at the edge of our vision. Christmas Eve was the breaking point. We'd invited my parents over, hoping their presence would keep the paranormal activity at bay. How wrong we were. It started small, ornaments falling off the tree, lights flickering. But it quickly escalated. The Christmas tree toppled over on its own. Presents went sliding across the floor. And then, to our horror, we heard a garbled voice come through the turned-off stereo. "Get out! Get out! Get out!" My parents fled in terror. Tom and I spent that night in a hotel, too afraid to return home. We put the house on the market immediately, but it took months to sell. Those were the longest, most terrifying months of my life. The entity seemed angry that we were trying to leave. The hauntings grew violent, objects hurled at our heads, scratches appearing on our skin. Finally, mercifully, we found a buyer. We didn't breathe easy until we'd signed those final papers and handed over the keys. We moved across the country, hoping to put as much distance between us and that house as possible. It's been over 25 years, but I still have nightmares about our time there. I've never been able to shake the feeling that something followed us. Sometimes I still wake up in the night to phantom footsteps or whispers. Tom and I don't talk about it much. It's too painful, too terrifying to relive. But I had to share our story as a warning. Be careful when buying an old house. You never know what or who might already be living there. I still remember that summer like it was yesterday. I was 15, bored out of my mind, and looking for any kind of excitement I could find in our sleepy little suburb. My parents were always working late, so I had the house to myself most days. That's when I started experimenting with weed and pills. Stupid teenage stuff, you know. I thought it would make things more interesting. Boy, was I wrong. It started small at first. I'd be up late at night, a little high, and I'd hear creaks and shuffling coming from the attic. I tried to brush it off as the house settling or maybe mice, but it sounded too deliberate, like footsteps pacing back and forth. Then things in my room started moving on their own. I'd set my phone down on my nightstand, look away for a second, and find it across the room. Or I'd wake up to find all my dresser drawers open when I knew I'd closed them the night before. I started feeling paranoid all the time, like I was being watched. My dog Buddy seemed to sense it too. He'd stare intently at empty corners of my room and growl at nothing. Sometimes he'd refuse to even come upstairs, whining at the bottom of the steps. The voices were the worst part, though. At first I thought it was just the drugs messing with my head. But even when I was sober, I'd hear whispers coming from the vents or closet. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but it sounded like a woman's voice, soft and sing-songy, but in a way that made my skin crawl. I started having these vivid nightmares about a woman with long black hair. In the dreams, she'd be standing at the foot of my bed, just staring at me with these milky white eyes. I'd try to scream or move, but I'd be paralyzed. Then she'd slowly crawl onto the bed towards me, her face inches from mine, and just as she was about to touch me, I'd jolt awake in a cold sweat. One night, I woke up from one of those dreams, and I swear to God I saw her standing in my doorway, just for a split second before she vanished. I was so freaked out I slept on the couch for a week after that. The activity seemed to ramp up the more I used. Looking back, maybe the drugs were weakening whatever mental barriers I had, making me more susceptible to this thing. But at the time, I was convinced the drugs were the only thing keeping me sane. How else could I cope with what was happening? It all came to a head one night when I was home alone. My parents were at some work function, and I decided to get really fucked up. I took way too many pills and smoked bowl after bowl until the room was spinning. That's when shit got real. The lights started flickering like crazy. At first I thought it was just me tripping, but then I heard this loud bang from upstairs. Buddy started going nuts, barking and scratching at the front door like he was desperate to get out. I was frozen in fear on the couch, my heart pounding out of my chest. Then I heard it. That woman's voice, clear as day, calling my name from the top of the stairs. "Jason," she said in this sickly sweet tone. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just sat there paralyzed as I heard slow footsteps coming down the stairs. Suddenly, all the lights in the house went out at once. In the pitch black, I could hear ragged breathing right next to my ear. I felt icy fingers brush the back of my neck and I lost it. I screamed and ran for the front door, fumbling with the lock in the dark. I finally got it open and booked it down the street in my pajamas, barefoot and sobbing. I ended up at my friend Mike's house. His parents let me crash there and called my mom and dad. I was an incoherent mess, babbling about ghosts and demons. They probably thought I was just having a bad trip. Hell, part of me hoped that's all it was. But when we went back to the house the next day, things were off. All the furniture in my room had been pushed to the center. There were scratches all over my door that definitely weren't there before. And written on my mirror in what looked like lipstick were the words, "Welcome home, Jason." My parents were freaked out, but tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone broke in, they said. But deep down, I think they knew something wasn't right. I overheard my dad telling my mom he'd seen a woman in a white dress standing at the end of the hallway the week before. He thought it was her at first, before realizing she was at work. I refused to sleep in that room again. I started crashing on the couch or at friends' houses. My grades tanked, and I was a nervous wreck. I begged my parents to move, but they didn't want to uproot our lives over what they saw as teenage rebellion and drug-induced paranoia. It wasn't until a month later that they finally believed me. We were eating dinner when we heard a massive crash from upstairs. We ran up to find my bedroom completely trashed. The mirror was shattered, my mattress was flipped, and everything was strewn across the floor. But the worst part was what was written on the wall in huge letters. "He belongs to me." We moved out that week, left most of our stuff behind, and stayed with my grandparents until we found a new place. I've been clean ever since, too scared to even take Advil some days. It's been 10 years, and I still have nightmares about that woman. I've tried to convince myself it was all in my head, just drugs and an overactive imagination. But some part of me knows what I experienced was real. Sometimes I still feel like I'm being watched, like she's out there somewhere, waiting. And honestly, that terrifies me more than anything. But when I opened the door and flipped on the lights, I froze in shock. The wall next to my bed was covered in dark red stains. They looked wet and were dripping down onto the floor. My heart started racing as I approached to get a closer look. The stains glistened in the light and had that same coppery smell I'd noticed earlier, but stronger now. I reached out hesitantly to touch one of the marks. My finger came away sticky and red. Oh, God. It was blood. Actual blood all over my bedroom wall. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. How the hell did this happen? I lived alone and hadn't had any guests over. The door had been locked when I got home. There were no signs of a break-in. But somehow, in the hours I'd been at work, my wall had become covered in blood. Panic started to set in as my imagination ran wild. Had someone been murdered in my apartment? Was there a body hidden somewhere? Or was this some kind of sick prank? I searched the rest of the apartment frantically, but found no other traces of blood or anything out of place. I knew I should probably call the police, but I was afraid they'd think I was involved somehow. Plus, I was exhausted and not thinking clearly. In my panicked state, all I could think about was getting rid of the evidence before anyone saw it. I ran to the kitchen and grabbed every cleaning product I could find. Bleach, all-purpose cleaner, paper towels, sponges. Then I got to work scrubbing the wall as hard as I could. The smell of bleach mixed with the metallic scent of blood made me gag, but I kept going. It took over an hour of furious scrubbing before I managed to get most of the stains off. My arms were aching and my hands were raw from the chemicals. There were still faint pinkish marks on the wall, but it was the best I could do. I opened all the windows to air out the smell and collapsed into bed, utterly drained. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those horrific blood stains. I kept imagining I heard noises in the apartment. By morning, I had almost convinced myself it had all been a vivid nightmare, but the lingering smell and the pinkish discoloration on the wall were stark reminders that it had been all too real. Over the next few days, I was a nervous wreck. I kept expecting the police to show up or for a body to be discovered, but nothing happened. Life went on as normal. After a week or two, I started to relax a bit. Maybe it really had just been some bizarre, unexplainable incident. I considered moving out, but my lease had several months left, and I couldn't afford to break it. So I tried my best to put it out of my mind. I rearranged my furniture to cover the discolored section of wall. I told myself it must have been a prank or some kind of leak that just looked like blood. Years passed, and I mostly forgot about that strange night. I moved to a new city for work and rarely thought about my old apartment. But then, about 5 years later, I came across a news article that made my blood run cold. It was about a cold case from my old neighborhood. A family of 4 had been brutally murdered in their apartment over a decade ago. The killer was never caught. As I read the details, my hands started shaking. The apartment number listed was mine. The murders had happened just a few months before I moved in. Suddenly, that night of inexplicable bloodstains came rushing back to me in vivid detail. The timing matched up perfectly. Had I somehow witnessed evidence of that horrific crime resurfacing? How was that even possible? I read every article I could find about the case. Apparently the family had been stabbed to death in their beds. The killer had used sheets to soak up much of the blood before fleeing. The bodies weren't found for several days. My mind was reeling as I tried to process this information. Had trace amounts of blood somehow seeped through the wall over time? Or was it something more supernatural? The echoes of a violent crime replaying themselves? I'm not usually one to believe in ghosts, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd experienced something beyond normal explanation that night. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what happened. Maybe there was a perfectly logical explanation that I'm overlooking. But deep down, I know what I saw. Those weren't just random stains. It was blood, fresh, dripping blood that appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as mysteriously. To this day, I still get chills thinking about it. The idea that I'd been sleeping in a room where an entire family was murdered is horrifying enough. But witnessing that inexplicable manifestation of blood years later, it haunts me. I can still smell that metallic odor and feel the sticky wetness on my fingers. I've never told anyone else this story before. Who would believe me? But I know what I experienced was real. Sometimes I wonder if the unsolved nature of the crime has left some kind of psychic imprint on that place, or if the victims were trying to reach out to make their presence known. I'll probably never know the full truth of what happened that night. But one thing's for certain. I'll never forget those bloodstains appearing out of thin air, or the terror I felt as I frantically scrubbed them away. It's a stark reminder that there are some mysteries in this world that defy explanation, no matter how much we might wish otherwise. We set out early in the morning, armed with snacks, water bottles, and an unquenchable thirst for adventure. The forest loomed before us, a wall of green that seemed to stretch endlessly. As we stepped into the shade of the trees, the temperature dropped noticeably, and a shiver ran down my spine. Looking back, I wonder if that was my instinct trying to warn me. At first, it was exhilarating. We climbed over fallen logs, ducked under low-hanging branches, and marveled at the shafts of sunlight breaking through the canopy. Ali was always the bravest, leading the way and calling out whenever she found something interesting. Jazeel was more cautious, constantly looking over his shoulder as if he expected something to jump out at us. We must have been walking for hours when I realized I couldn't hear Ali or Jazeel anymore. I called out, but there was no response. The forest seemed to swallow my voice. Panic started to set in as I spun around, trying to figure out which way we'd come from. Everything looked the same, just endless trees and undergrowth. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was Jazeel playing a trick on me. But as the figure stepped out from behind a massive oak tree, I realized it wasn't Jazeel at all. It was a boy, maybe my age or a little older, dressed in clothes that looked like they were from an old movie. He wore a crisp white shirt, suspenders, and short pants that ended just below his knees. His hair was neatly combed to the side, but it was his eyes that made my blood run cold. They were completely white. No iris, no pupil, just an endless expanse of white. I blinked hard, thinking it must be a trick of the light. But when I opened my eyes, he was still there, those blank eyes fixed on me. He smiled, and it was the most unnatural thing I'd ever seen. It was too wide, showing too many teeth. "Hello," he said, his voice oddly melodic. "Would you like to play?" I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. Who are you?" I managed to stammer out. He tilted his head to the side, the movement jerky and unnatural. "I've been waiting for someone to play with for so long. Won't you join me?" He took a step towards me, and that broke the spell. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at my face and arms. I could hear him behind me, his laughter echoing through the trees. "Don't go," he called. "We have so many games to play." I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were on fire. I didn't dare look back, terrified of what I might see. Eventually, I burst out of the tree line, nearly collapsing on the sun-baked grass of the field that bordered the forest. To my shock, Ali and Jazeel were there, looking worried and confused. "Where have you been?" Ali demanded. "We've been waiting for ages," I tried to explain, words tumbling out in a frantic jumble. I told them about getting lost, about the strange boy with the white eyes. But as I spoke, I could see the doubt in their faces. They hadn't seen anything unusual. They'd simply walked out of the forest when they realized I wasn't with them and had been waiting for me ever since. We walked home in silence, my friends clearly unsure what to make of my story. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the boy following us. But there was nothing, just the dark line of trees in the distance. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that unnatural smile, those blank white eyes. I heard his voice in the whisper of the wind outside my window. "Won't you join me?" In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination brought on by fear and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen was real. I never went back to that forest. Even as I grew older, I'd take the long way around rather than walk near those trees. Years passed. I got married, had a son named Caleb. We moved back to my hometown when he was 5, into a house not far from where I'd grown up. One day, Caleb came running in, excited about the big forest he'd seen. He wanted to explore it. The fear that gripped me in that moment was like ice in my veins. "No," I said, perhaps too sharply. "That forest is off limits." Caleb's face fell, and I felt guilty. But I couldn't shake the memory of that day, of that boy with his too wide smile and blank eyes. I couldn't risk my son encountering whatever I had seen in those woods. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself staring out the window at that dark line of trees in the distance. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I see a small figure at the edge of the forest, standing perfectly still, waiting for someone to come and play. I've never told anyone the full story until now. My husband thinks I'm just overprotective, and maybe I am. But I know what I saw that day, and I know that something in those woods is not natural. Something is waiting. So if you're ever near a forest that seems too quiet, too still, remember my story. And if you hear a voice calling out, asking you to play, run, and don't look back. Because some games, once started, can never be finished. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural, but what happened to me last summer on that lonely mountain road changed everything. I still get chills thinking about it, even now as I type this out. It was supposed to be a routine trip to visit my grandparents. They live in this tiny rural town nestled in the mountains, about a 3-hour drive from the city. I'd made the trip dozens of times before without incident. This time was different. I left later than usual, around 7 p.m., figuring I'd arrive by 10. The sun was already setting as I hit the winding mountain roads. There was hardly any traffic, just me and the darkening forest all around. About an hour in, the hairs on the back of my neck started to stand up. I felt like I was being watched, even though I couldn't see anyone else around. I turned up the radio, trying to shake off the creepy feeling. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, a figure darted across the road right in front of my car. I slammed on the brakes and swerved, my heart pounding. I was certain I'd hit someone, but when I got out to look, there was nothing there. No person, no animal, not even a mark on the road. Shaken, I got back in the car. I told myself it must have been a deer or something, my eyes playing tricks on me in the dark. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. What I'd seen looked human. I continued driving, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The uneasy feeling grew stronger with each mile. I kept checking my mirrors, unable to shake the sense that someone or something was right behind me. Then I saw them, a pair of glowing eyes in my rearview mirror. They weren't reflecting my headlights. They were emitting their own eerie light. I whipped my head around, but the back seat was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the eyes were gone. My breath was coming in short gasps now. I was trembling all over, fighting the urge to pull over. But some instinct told me that stopping would be even worse. That's when I heard the voice, a raspy whisper, right in my ear. "You'll be dead soon." I nearly drove off the road. I cranked up the radio to drown it out, but the voice kept repeating, "You'll be dead soon. You'll be dead soon." Panic overtook me. I floored it, taking the curves way too fast. I just wanted to get to my grandparents' house, to safety. The trees blurred past as I raced down the mountain. Suddenly, my headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was a young man, maybe early 20s. He was pale as a ghost, with dark, hollow eyes, and he was smiling at me. I screamed and jerked the wheel. The car spun out of control. I felt the sickening lurch as it left the road, tumbling down the steep embankment. The world spun crazily around me. The last thing I remember is the sound of crunching metal and shattering glass. I woke up in the hospital 2 days later. By some miracle, I'd survived with just a concussion and some broken ribs. The doctors said I was lucky to be alive after going off that cliff. But I didn't feel lucky. The memories of what I'd seen and heard on that road haunted me. I couldn't sleep without nightmares. Even after I was released from the hospital, I felt wrong, like something dark was clinging to me. My grandma, bless her heart, could tell something was seriously wrong. She's always been into that New Age spiritual stuff. She insisted on taking me to see this psychic lady she knows. I was skeptical, but desperate for answers. The psychic took one look at me and went pale. She said I had a hitchhiker, the spirit of a young man who had died violently on that road years ago. Apparently, he was using me to try and come back to life. It sounded crazy, but after what I'd experienced, I was willing to believe anything. The psychic said we needed to do a cleansing ritual to get rid of the spirit. It wasn't cheap, but I would have paid anything to feel normal again. The ritual itself is mostly a blur. There was a lot of chanting, burning herbs, and other weird stuff I didn't understand. But I'll never forget the moment I felt it leave me. It was like a weight lifting off my chest, allowing me to breathe freely for the first time in weeks. Since then, things have mostly gone back to normal. But I still can't bring myself to drive that mountain road again. Sometimes at night, I swear I can still hear that whisper. "You'll be dead soon." It makes me wonder, did we really get rid of the spirit? Or is it just biding its time, waiting to finish what it started? I don't know if anyone will believe this story. Hell, I'm not sure I believe it myself some days. But I know what I experienced was real. So if you're ever driving a lonely mountain road at night and get that feeling of being watched, don't ignore it. And whatever you do, don't stop. First, I just walked aimlessly through the suburban streets near our house, trying to process what had happened and figure out my next move. But as night fell and the temperature dropped, I realized I needed to find some kind of shelter. That's when I remembered the wooded area on the outskirts of our neighborhood. I figured I could at least find a secluded spot there to hunker down for the night. As I made my way into the trees, the sounds of traffic and barking dogs faded away. Soon I was surrounded by darkness and eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves under my feet. I pulled out my phone to use as a makeshift flashlight, its dim glow barely illuminating the path ahead. The further I went, the denser the woods became. Branches snagged at my clothes, and I had to duck under low-hanging limbs. My heart was pounding, and every shadow seemed to hide some unknown threat. I kept telling myself there was nothing to be afraid of. It was just trees and bushes after all. But being alone in the pitch-black forest at night was seriously freaking me out. After what felt like hours of walking, I came to a small clearing. Exhausted and shivering, I decided this was as good a spot as any to try and get some rest. I gathered some leaves into a makeshift bed and huddled up against the base of a large oak tree, pulling my thin jacket tightly around me. As I lay there in the darkness, straining my ears for any sound, that's when I first heard it. Heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush nearby. At first I thought it must be a deer or some other animal, but the footsteps sounded too heavy, too deliberate. A chill ran down my spine as I realized whatever was making those sounds was much larger than a deer. I held my breath, hoping that if I stayed perfectly still, whatever it was would pass by without noticing me. But the footsteps kept getting closer and closer. Then I heard a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. This was no ordinary forest animal. Panicked, I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees around me. But I couldn't see anything moving out there. The growling had stopped, but I could still hear those heavy footsteps circling around the clearing. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this some kind of large predator that had wandered out of the deeper wilderness? Or was my fear-addled brain playing tricks on me? Either way, I knew I couldn't stay there. I scrambled to my feet, shining the light frantically in all directions as I tried to figure out which way to run. But no matter where I pointed the beam, I couldn't see any sign of what was stalking me. The footsteps and occasional growls seemed to be coming from all around, as if I was surrounded. Heart pounding, I picked a direction at random and took off running. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the undergrowth. I could hear whatever it was crashing through the woods behind me, gaining ground. The sound of its heavy breathing filled my ears. I ran blindly through the dark forest, my lungs burning and legs aching. Several times I nearly fell, stumbling over roots and rocks. But sheer terror kept me on my feet. I was certain that if I went down, that thing would be on me in seconds. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I burst out of the tree line onto a rural road. Without hesitation, I sprinted down the pavement, desperate to put as much distance as possible between me and those woods. After about half a mile, I came upon a small bus shelter on the roadside and ducked inside. Gasping for breath, I crouched down in the corner of the shelter and peered back the way I'd come. The road was empty and silent. There was no sign of whatever had been chasing me. I stayed there for what felt like hours, jumping at every little sound and ready to bolt at a moment's notice. But nothing emerged from those dark woods. As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I finally allowed myself to relax slightly. I was freezing, exhausted, and my whole body ached, but I had survived the night. I dozed fitfully for a while, jerking awake at the slightest noise. When full daylight arrived, I cautiously made my way back towards town. I was dreading having to face my mom again, but I knew I couldn't stay out here. As I walked, I tried to make sense of what had happened in those woods. Had it all been in my imagination, just my fears manifesting in the dark? Or was there really something out there? I've replayed that night over and over in my head since then. Sometimes I manage to convince myself it was all just a product of fear and exhaustion. But then I'll wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of those growls and heavy footsteps echoing in my mind. And I know that whatever was in those woods that night was all too real. I've never told anyone else about what happened. Who would believe me? But I warn you, if you ever find yourself alone in the woods at night, and you hear something big moving in the darkness around you, run. Run as fast as you can and don't look back, because you really don't want to see what's hunting you. I'll never forget that day. It was a chilly autumn evening, and I was exhausted after my ballet class. My mom had picked me up along with my little brother Tommy, and we were walking home along the train tracks like we always did. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the gravel and rusty rails. As we walked, I noticed something unusual up ahead, a man lying motionless beside the tracks. At first I thought he was just sleeping, but as we got closer, I felt a strange uneasiness creep over me. There was something off about the way he was positioned, sprawled out awkwardly, as if he'd collapsed there. Tommy, always curious and oblivious to danger, piped up, "Hey Mom, look at that guy. Should we wake him up? It's gonna get cold soon." I saw Mom tense up, her grip tightening on Tommy's hand. "No, honey, we're not going to do that. Let's just keep walking." Her voice had that forced, calm tone she used when she was trying not to scare us. As we drew level with the man, I couldn't help but stare. He was dressed in tattered clothes, his face gaunt and unshaven. But what struck me most were his eyes, wide open and glassy, staring blankly at the darkening sky. I'd never seen a dead person before, but somehow I knew instinctively that this man wasn't alive. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the autumn air. I wanted to run, to get as far away from this unsettling scene as possible. But Mom kept us moving at a steady pace, her jaw clenched tight. "Don't look," she murmured. "Just keep walking." But I couldn't tear my eyes away. As we passed by, I could have sworn I saw the man's head turn ever so slightly to watch us go. A strangled gasp escaped my throat. "Mommy," I whimpered. "It's okay, sweetie. We're almost home." The rest of the walk passed in tense silence. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the man following us. But the tracks behind us remained empty in the gathering gloom. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that man's vacant stare. I tossed and turned, plagued by nightmares of cold, grasping hands reaching for me from the shadows. The next morning, Mom was on the phone when I came down for breakfast. Her face was pale, her voice hushed and worried. When she hung up, she turned to me with a forced smile. "Honey, about what we saw yesterday. I need you to forget about it, okay? It wasn't anything for us to worry about." But I could tell from her expression that it was very much something to worry about. And later that day, I overheard her talking to Dad in hushed tones. "They found him this morning. Some poor homeless man dead on the tracks. They think he might have been there for days." My blood ran cold. Days. But we had seen him just yesterday, hadn't we? I wanted to speak up, to tell them what I'd seen. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear, or maybe some part of me already knew the truth, that what we'd encountered wasn't something that could be explained away. Years passed, and I tried to forget about that evening. I convinced myself it was just a weird childhood memory, blown out of proportion by an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew better. Then last week, I was flipping through an old local newspaper at the library, researching for a school project. And there, staring up at me from a grainy black and white photo, was the face that had haunted my nightmares for years. The article was dated 2 weeks before that fateful evening. It detailed the disappearance of a local homeless man, last seen near the train tracks. The photo showed him in happier times, clean-shaven, with clear eyes and a hesitant smile. But I'd recognize that face anywhere. My hands shook as I read the article. According to the timeline, the man had already been missing for days before we saw him that night, which meant I felt sick. All these years, I'd tried to rationalize what happened, to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a strange coincidence. But now I was faced with undeniable proof that what we'd seen that night wasn't just a man sleeping on the tracks. We'd seen a ghost, the lingering spirit of a man whose body lay undiscovered, reaching out to the living in his final moments. I haven't told anyone about my discovery. Who would believe me? Sometimes I'm not even sure I believe it myself. But late at night, when the wind whistles outside my window, I find myself thinking back to that autumn evening. I wonder if he's still there, that lost soul by the train tracks, still waiting for someone to notice him, to acknowledge his existence. And I wonder how many other spirits are out there, trapped between worlds, desperately trying to make contact. One thing's for sure, I'll never look at the train tracks the same way again. And on dark nights, when I have to walk that route home, I find myself quickening my pace. Because now I know that sometimes the things we see out of the corner of our eye are more real than we'd like to admit. I've tried to rationalize it, to find some logical explanation. Maybe we did see a real man that night, and my mind is just playing tricks on me, mixing up the timeline. Maybe it's all just a series of strange coincidences. But deep down, I know the truth. I can still see those glassy eyes, that slight turn of the head as we passed. No living person could have moved like that. And the chill I felt, it wasn't just from the autumn air. It was the cold touch of the otherworldly. I've done research since then, looking into local ghost stories and paranormal encounters. And I've found that our experience isn't unique. There are countless tales of spirits lingering at the sites of their deaths, reaching out to the living in their final moments. Some say that violent or sudden deaths can trap a soul, leaving it confused and unable to move on. Others believe that unfinished business keeps spirits tethered to our world. Whatever the reason, I'm now certain that what we encountered that night was a soul caught between worlds. I've thought about going back to those tracks to see if I can find any trace of him, but something always holds me back. Fear, maybe, or perhaps a deeper understanding that some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed. So I'm left with this story, this memory that refuses to fade. A reminder that the world is stranger and more mysterious than we often allow ourselves to believe. And a lingering question that haunts me to this day. If we had stopped that night, if we had tried to help, could we have changed things? Could we have given that lost soul the peace it was seeking? Or would we have been drawn into something dark and dangerous, something beyond our understanding? I'll never know the answer. But I do know this: that encounter changed me. It opened my eyes to a world beyond our own, a realm of shadows and whispers that exists just out of sight. And while part of me wishes I could go back to the blissful ignorance of before, another part is grateful for the glimpse behind the veil. Because now I know that we're not alone in this world, that there are things out there beyond our understanding. And while that knowledge can be terrifying, it's also strangely comforting. It reminds me that there's more to existence than what we can see and touch. So if you're ever walking alone at night and you feel a sudden chill or catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of your eye, don't be too quick to dismiss it. You might just be brushing up against the unknown, against the countless stories and souls that surround us every day. And who knows, maybe someday you'll have a story of your own to tell. A moment when the veil between worlds grew thin, and you found yourself face to face with something you can't explain. When that happens, remember my story. Remember that you're not alone in your experience. And most importantly, remember to keep walking. Because sometimes that's all we can do when confronted with the unknown. Keep moving forward and hope that whatever lies beyond is watching over us with benevolent eyes. On my third day there, I met Jake and Chris, two local boys around my age. We hit it off immediately, bonding over our shared love for adventure and mischief. That's when they told me about the forbidden part of the woods. There's this area deep in the forest, Jake said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. It's all fenced off with barbed wire. Your grandpa ever mention it? I shook my head. No. What's the deal with it? Chris leaned in, lowering his voice. They say it's haunted. Some girl died there years ago, and weird stuff's been happening ever since. I rolled my eyes. Come on, guys. Haunted woods? That's straight out of a bad horror movie. Jake grinned. Want to check it out? I hesitated. My grandpa had warned me not to wander too deep into the woods, but curiosity got the better of me. Sure, why not? The next day we set off early in the morning. I told my grandpa we were going fishing at the nearby creek. He looked at me suspiciously but didn't say anything. As we hiked through the woods, I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were doing something wrong. After about an hour of walking, we came across the barbed wire fence. It looked old and rusted, with faded no trespassing signs hanging from it. The trees beyond seemed darker, more twisted somehow. This is it, Jake whispered. You guys ready? We exchanged nervous glances, then nodded. Chris found a gap in the fence, and we squeezed through one by one. As soon as I stepped onto the other side, a chill ran down my spine. The air felt heavier, colder. We wandered deeper into the restricted area. The silence was eerie. No birds chirping, no insects buzzing, just the sound of our footsteps and our increasingly nervous breathing. That's when things started getting weird. At first, it was subtle. The shadows seemed to move when we weren't looking directly at them. Then, we started hearing whispers, faint, incomprehensible, but definitely there. Guys, do you hear that? I asked, my voice shaky. Jake and Chris nodded, their faces pale. We huddled closer together, our earlier bravado evaporating. Suddenly, the temperature dropped dramatically. I could see my breath misting in front of me. In July, in the middle of the day. Maybe we should head back, Chris suggested, his voice cracking. We turned around, but nothing looked familiar. The trees all blended together, and I couldn't remember which way we had come from. Panic started to set in. That's when I glanced at my watch. We'd only been in there for about 20 minutes, but when I looked up at the sky, my heart nearly stopped. It was dark, not twilight, not dusk, but pitch black night. "What the hell?" Jake exclaimed. "How is it night already?" We stood there, frozen in shock and fear. The whispers grew louder, and I swear I saw a pale figure dart between the trees. "Run!" I yelled. We took off, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping our faces. I had no idea where we were going, but anywhere was better than here. The whispers turned into wails, filling the air around us. After what felt like hours of running, we burst through the tree line and found ourselves back at the fence. We scrambled through the gap, not caring about the barbed wire tearing at our clothes. We didn't stop running until we reached the edge of town. Panting and terrified, we finally slowed down. That's when we noticed the commotion. There were police cars and a crowd of people near my grandpa's house. As we approached, I saw my grandpa. He looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. When he saw me, his eyes widened in disbelief. "Tommy?" he croaked. "Oh my God, Tommy!" He rushed over and hugged me tightly. I was confused. Why was everyone acting like this? Then I saw my parents. They weren't supposed to arrive for another week, but there they were, looking exhausted and stressed. "Mom? Dad? What's going on?" I asked. My mom burst into tears and hugged me. My dad just stared at me, his face a mix of relief and anger. "Where have you been?" he demanded. "We've been searching for days." Days? That couldn't be right. We'd only been gone for a few hours at most. But as I looked around, I saw the same confused and relieved expressions on Jake and Chris's parents' faces. The police started questioning us, but we were too shocked to give coherent answers. How could we explain something we didn't understand ourselves? Later that night, after the chaos had died down a bit, my grandpa sat me down. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, his eyes full of a mixture of relief and fear. "Tommy," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something about those woods." He told me about a girl named Emily who had died in those woods back in the 1950s. She'd gone swimming in a hidden pond and drowned. After that, strange things started happening in that part of the forest. People would go in and come out hours or even days later with no memory of where they'd been. Some never came out at all. "That's why we fenced it off," he explained, "to keep people safe. I should have told you earlier, but I didn't want to scare you." I sat there trying to process everything. It didn't make sense. How could we have lost days? What happened to us in there? The authorities chalked it up to us getting lost and confused about time. They said the haunted story was just a local legend. But I know what we experienced was real. It's been years since that day, and I still can't explain what happened. Jake, Chris, and I don't talk about it much anymore. It's like there's this unspoken agreement between us to pretend it never happened. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those whispers, and when I close my eyes, I see shadows moving in a forest that's darker than it should be. I never went back to those woods. My grandpa sold his house and moved closer to us in the city. He said he couldn't bear to live near those woods anymore. I've tried to research similar incidents, looking for any explanation for what we experienced. But nothing comes close to what happened to us. It's like those woods exist in some kind of bubble, where time and reality don't work the same way. The strangest part? When we finally checked our phones after getting back, they all showed the same thing. The date was 5 days later than when we entered the woods, but our phones had only lost about 1% battery. It's as if time passed for the rest of the world, but not for us. I still have nightmares about those woods. In them, I'm wandering through the twisted trees, lost and alone. I hear Emily's voice calling out to me, begging for help, but I can never find her. I just keep walking and walking as the shadows grow longer and the whispers get louder. Sometimes I wonder if we ever really left those woods. Maybe a part of us is still there, trapped in that timeless, haunted place. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I fear that one day those woods might call us back, and next time we might not be able to find our way out. So if you're ever in a small town surrounded by dense forests, and the locals tell you about a part of the woods that's off limits, listen to them. Some boundaries exist for a reason. Some places aren't meant for us to explore, because once you step into a place where the normal rules don't apply, you might never truly step out again. It was just supposed to be a stupid dare, you know. That's how these things always start. My friends and I were bored one Friday night, sitting around complaining that nothing ever happens in our sleepy little coastal town. That's when Jake got that look in his eye, the one that always means trouble. "Hey, you guys ever hear about the old Blackwood mansion?" he asked with a mischievous grin. Of course we had. Everyone knew the stories about that creepy abandoned place on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. It had been empty for decades, ever since the infamous Blackwood murders back in the 80s. The whole family was found dead inside. Mom, Dad, 3 kids. Police said it was a murder-suicide, but there were always rumors of something more sinister. "We should check it out," Jake continued, "unless you're all too scared." I rolled my eyes, but my heart was already beating faster at the thought. That place is probably crawling with rats and mold. No thanks. But peer pressure is a powerful thing when you're 17. Before I knew it, we were piling into Jake's beat-up Jeep and heading for the coast. There were 5 of us, me, Jake, his girlfriend Megan, my best friend Zoe, and Zoe's cousin Alex, who was visiting for the weekend. The drive out there was tense. We tried to keep things light, cracking jokes and blasting music, but as we got closer, the mood shifted. The road got darker and more isolated. Trees pressed in on both sides, branches scraping against the windows. By the time we reached the overgrown driveway leading up to the mansion, my palms were sweating. We parked a little ways down the road and continued on foot, not wanting to draw attention. The house loomed ahead of us, a dark silhouette against the night sky. Paint peeling, windows boarded up, roof sagging. It looked like something out of a horror movie. "Maybe this isn't such a good idea," Megan said nervously as we approached the front porch. "Don't be such a baby," Jake teased, but I could hear the slight tremor in his voice too. The front door was locked, but we found a broken window around back that we could squeeze through. One by one, we climbed inside, phone flashlights cutting through the darkness. The interior was like stepping back in time. Faded wallpaper, dusty furniture draped in sheets, family photos still hanging crooked on the walls. It was eerie how much had been left behind, like the family just vanished into thin air one day. We crept through the rooms, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. I tried to imagine what it must have been like, living out here so isolated from everything. No wonder people said Old Man Blackwood went crazy. It was in one of the upstairs bedrooms that we found it. Zoe was poking around an old dresser when she called us over excitedly. "Guys, look at this." She held up a small leather-bound book, a diary. We gathered around as she opened it, revealing pages and pages of neat handwriting. It was dated about 6 months before the murders. "Oh my God," Megan breathed. "Is this?" "It's gotta be," Jake said. "One of the Blackwood kids." I felt a chill run down my spine as Zoe started to read aloud. April 15th. "Dad's been acting strange lately. He barely leaves his study anymore. When he does come out, he's jumpy and paranoid. Mom says not to worry, but I can tell she's scared too. Something's not right. We exchanged uneasy glances. This was way more intense than we'd bargained for. Zoe flipped ahead a few pages and continued. May 3rd, I overheard Dad on the phone last night. He was arguing with someone saying he wanted out, that he'd done his part and now they needed to leave us alone. Who was he talking to? What did he do? My skin was crawling now. I wanted to tell Zoe to stop, to put the diary back where we found it and get the hell out of there. But a morbid curiosity kept me rooted to the spot. June 20th, they came to the house today. 3 men in dark suits. Dad wouldn't let them inside, but I watched from my window as they argued on the porch. One of them had a gun. I'm so scared. Zoe's voice was shaking now as she read the final entry. July 1st. I think this might be my last entry. Dad says we have to leave tonight. Pack only what we can carry. He won't tell us where we're going, just that it's not safe here anymore. I can hear cars coming up the drive. Oh God, what's happening? I don't want to The writing cut off abruptly. We all stood there in stunned silence for a moment. Holy shit, Alex finally whispered. So it wasn't a murder-suicide after all. They were executed. I felt sick to my stomach. This was so much worse than any of the rumors or ghost stories. This was real. A family hunted down and killed in cold blood, right where we were standing. That's when we heard it. A car engine, growing louder as it approached the house. Panic gripped me as we all stared at each other wide-eyed. Who the hell would be coming out here in the middle of the night? We need to go. Now, I hissed. We scrambled for the stairs, hearts pounding. But as we reached the main floor, headlights swept across the windows. Whoever it was, they were already here. Jake pulled us into a closet just as we heard car doors slamming outside. We huddled there in the darkness, barely daring to breathe. Heavy footsteps on the porch, the creak of the front door opening. Check upstairs, a gruff voice ordered. I'll take this floor. Oh God, this couldn't be happening. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying they wouldn't find us, praying this was all just a bad dream I'd wake up from any second. The floorboards groaned as someone moved through the house, getting closer, closer. The closet door flew open. I screamed. We all did. But instead of guns or angry faces, we were met with the bewildered stare of a middle-aged man in a police uniform. What the hell? He exclaimed, shining his flashlight over us. You kids shouldn't be in here. This is private property. We stumbled out of the closet, babbling apologies and explanations. The cop, Officer Davis, according to his name tag, listened with growing concern as we told him about the diary and what we'd read. Christ, he muttered, running a hand over his face. I always knew there was more to this case. He radioed for backup, then had us sit in the living room while we waited. I clutched the diary tightly, still reeling from everything that had happened. The next few hours passed in a blur. More cops showed up. We gave statements. Our parents were called. They let us go home eventually, but not before confiscating the diary as evidence. Officer Davis assured us they'd look into it, see if they could finally get some answers about what really happened to the Blackwoods. It's been 3 months now. The case was reopened, but from what I've heard, they haven't made much progress. Too much time has passed. Too many leads gone cold. Sometimes I wonder if we did the right thing, bringing all this to light again. Maybe some secrets are meant to stay buried. But then I think about that poor family, about the terrified girl writing in her diary, knowing her time was running out. They deserved justice, even if it came decades too late. I don't go near the old Blackwood place anymore. None of us do. But sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I swear I can hear whispers carried on the ocean breeze, echoes of the past, of lives cut tragically short. And I wonder, will we ever really know the full truth of what happened in that house on the cliffs? Or are some mysteries destined to remain unsolved forever? It all started on a Friday night about a month ago. Me and 4 of my friends from high school decided to go on a night hike in Black Star Canyon. We'd heard all the spooky stories about the place, the legends of Native American massacres, ghost sightings, you name it. But we were bored teenagers looking for a thrill, so of course we thought it would be fun to check it out after dark. Looking back, I wish we'd just stayed home and watched a scary movie instead. We met up around 9 p.m. in the parking lot at the trailhead. There were 5 of us total: me, Jake, Melissa, Chris, and Tyler. We'd brought flashlights, snacks, and water, thinking we'd just do a quick hike and be back in a couple hours. Man, were we wrong. As soon as we started down the trail, I got an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. The darkness seemed to press in all around us, swallowing up the beams from our flashlights. Every rustle in the bushes made me jump, but I didn't want to seem like a wuss in front of my friends, so I tried to play it cool. We hiked for about 30 minutes, joking around and trying to scare each other. But then Jake stopped suddenly and pointed off to the side of the trail. "Guys, do you see that?" he whispered. We all turned to look. At first I didn't see anything, just the vague outlines of some fences in the distance. But then I saw it, a dark figure standing motionless by one of the fences. It looked like the silhouette of a man wearing a cowboy hat. A chill ran down my spine. "What the hell is that?" I hissed. "It's probably just a shadow or something," Chris said, but he sounded uncertain. We stood frozen, staring at the figure. It didn't move at all, just stood there eerily still. After a minute or two, Melissa tugged on my arm. "Come on, let's keep going," she said. "It's creeping me out." We continued down the trail, but now the joking atmosphere was gone. Everyone was on edge, jumping at every little sound. I kept glancing back over my shoulder, half expecting to see the shadowy figure following us. About 10 minutes later, Tyler stopped abruptly. "There it is again!" he exclaimed, pointing off to our right. Sure enough, the same dark silhouette was visible in the distance, standing next to another fence. It was unmistakably the same cowboy figure we'd seen before. "Okay, this is getting weird," Jake said. "How did it get over there so fast?" "Maybe it's just a coincidence," Melissa suggested weakly. "It could be a different shadow that just looks similar." But we all knew that wasn't true. It was exactly the same distinctive shape. A tall man in a cowboy hat, unnaturally still. Chris let out a nervous laugh. "Come on, guys, we're just freaking ourselves out. It's probably some kind of optical illusion or something." We tried to rationalize it, but deep down, we all felt that something very strange was happening. The carefree vibe of our hike was completely gone now. We huddled closer together as we walked, constantly scanning our surroundings. Things only got weirder from there. Over the next hour or so, we spotted the shadowy cowboy figure 4 more times. Each time it was in a different location, always standing motionless next to a fence. It was like it was following us, appearing in impossible places with no explanation. By this point, we were all thoroughly freaked out. The initial skepticism had given way to genuine fear. This wasn't just our imaginations. We were all seeing the same inexplicable thing. "Guys, I really think we should turn back," Melissa said, her voice shaking slightly. "This doesn't feel right." I was inclined to agree, but Jake insisted we press on a little further. "We've come this far, we might as well finish the trail," he argued. In hindsight, that was a huge mistake. We continued hiking for another 15 minutes or so. The shadows seemed to deepen around us, and strange whispers seemed to emanate from the darkness. I told myself it was just the wind, but it sounded disturbingly like muffled voices. Suddenly, Tyler let out a blood-curdling scream. We all whirled around to see him clawing at his back, a look of terror on his face. "Something's on me," he yelled. "Get it off!" Jake rushed over and lifted up the back of Tyler's shirt. We all gasped in shock. 3 long, angry red scratches ran diagonally across Tyler's back, as if he'd been clawed by some kind of animal. But there was nothing there. No animal, no person, nothing that could have caused those wounds. They had quite literally appeared out of nowhere. That was the last straw. We all started sprinting back down the trail towards the parking lot, blind panic taking over. I've never run so fast in my life. Every shadow seemed to hide some malevolent presence. The whispers grew louder, and I swear I heard the sound of ghostly laughter echoing through the canyon. When we finally burst out of the trailhead and into the parking lot, we were all gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. We piled into Jake's car and sped away as fast as we could. We drove in shocked silence for a while, trying to process what had just happened. Finally, Chris spoke up. What the hell was that?" he asked shakily. None of us had an answer. We examined Tyler's back again in the light of the car. The scratches were still there, red and inflamed. There was no logical explanation for how they had appeared. We tried to come up with rational explanations for what we'd experienced. But deep down, we all knew we had encountered something supernatural and terrifying that night in Black Star Canyon. It's been weeks now, and I still have nightmares about that shadowy cowboy figure. I wake up in a cold sweat, feeling like something is watching me from the darkness. Tyler's scratches have mostly healed, but they left faint scars, a permanent reminder of that night. We've all agreed never to go back to Black Star Canyon, especially not at night. Whatever malevolent presence lurks there, we want no part of it. But I can't shake the feeling that by entering that place, we opened some kind of door, that by seeing what we saw, we've somehow marked ourselves. I find myself obsessively researching the history of Black Star Canyon, looking for any clues about what we encountered. There are old stories of a murderous cowboy who used to prey on travelers in the area. Could it be his restless spirit that we saw, or something even darker? I don't know if I'll ever fully understand or come to terms with what happened that night. All I know is that there are things in this world beyond our comprehension. Dark, ancient things that should be left undisturbed. We caught a glimpse behind the veil that separates our world from theirs, and I'll never be the same. So if you're ever tempted to go exploring Black Star Canyon at night, take it from me, don't. Some places are better left alone. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, because once you've seen what lurks in those shadows, you can never unsee it. I still feel watched sometimes, even in broad daylight. Out of the corner of my eye, I'll catch a glimpse of a tall figure in a cowboy hat, but when I turn to look, it's gone. Just a trick of the light, I tell myself, but deep down, I know better. Whatever was awakened that night in Black Star Canyon, I fear it followed us out, and I can't shake the feeling that someday, somehow, it will find us again. I still remember that day like it was yesterday, even though it's been over 20 years now. It was the summer of 2002, and I was 11 years old. My friends and I lived in a pretty rough part of town, the kind of place where you learn to grow up fast. There were 6 of us kids who always hung out together. Me, Joey, Lizzie, Marcus, Danny, and Kevin. We didn't have much, but we had each other and our imaginations. That summer, we spent almost every day exploring the big park at the edge of our neighborhood. It was like our own private kingdom. We knew every tree, every hiding spot, every shortcut through the woods, or at least we thought we did. One scorching hot day in July, we decided to venture deeper into the wooded area than we ever had before. It was Joey's idea. He was always pushing us to go further, do more. "Come on, guys. I bet there's cool stuff back there that no one's ever seen," he said excitedly. We were bored and restless, so we agreed. We hiked for what felt like hours, swatting mosquitoes and wiping sweat from our foreheads. The deeper we went, the denser the trees became. It was like the forest was swallowing us up. I remember feeling a growing sense of unease, like we shouldn't be there. But of course, I didn't say anything. I didn't want the others to think I was scared. Just when I was about to suggest we turn back, we stumbled into a small clearing. And that's when we saw it, the camp. It was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. There were these strange tent-like structures, but they weren't made of normal fabric. They looked almost organic, like they'd grown out of the ground. There was a fire pit in the center, with embers still glowing faintly. Scattered around were odd tools and objects I couldn't identify. It was like we'd stepped into another world. "Whoa," breathed Marcus. "What is this place?" We spread out, cautiously exploring. I noticed strange symbols carved into the trees surrounding the clearing. They made my skin crawl. "Guys, maybe we shouldn't be here," Lizzie said nervously. "What if someone comes back?" "Don't be such a baby," Joey scoffed, but I could tell he was freaked out too. That's when we heard it, a soft, pitiful mewing sound. We all froze. "It's coming from over there," Danny whispered, pointing to a gnarled old oak tree at the edge of the clearing. We crept closer, and I felt my blood turn to ice. Hanging from one of the lower branches was a small burlap sack. It was moving. Kevin, always the bravest, or maybe the most foolish of us, reached up and carefully untied the sack. As it fell open, a tiny black kitten tumbled out onto the ground. For a split second, we all just stared in shock. Then the kitten looked up at us with these huge, terrified eyes. But they weren't normal cat eyes. They were a deep, unnatural purple color, and they seemed almost human. That's when everything went to hell. The kitten let out an ear-splitting shriek that sounded nothing like any animal I've ever heard. It was like a human scream mixed with static on a radio. At the same moment, the ground started to shake. The air felt electric, making the hair on my arms stand up. "Run!" I screamed, and we all took off like shots. We tore through the woods, branches whipping our faces, roots trying to trip us. I could hear heavy footsteps and crashing sounds behind us, like something massive was giving chase. But I didn't dare look back. We ran for what felt like hours, our lungs burning, until we finally burst out of the tree line back into the familiar part of the park. We collapsed onto the grass, gasping for air. "What? What the hell was that?" panted Joey. "We have to tell someone," Lizzie insisted. "The police or someone." We argued for a bit, but finally agreed to go to the police station. Of course, they didn't believe us. They probably thought we were just some punk kids making up stories. But they must have seen how terrified we were, because they agreed to send a couple officers to check it out. We led them back to where we thought the camp was, but there was nothing there. No tents, no fire pit, no strange symbols, not even a single footprint. The officers were clearly annoyed, thinking we'd wasted their time. We tried to explain, to insist it had been there just hours ago, but they just told us to go home and stop making up stories. For years after that, we tried to make sense of what happened. We went back to that spot dozens of times, but we never found anything. It was like the whole thing had just vanished. As I got older, I started to wonder if maybe we'd experienced some kind of time slip. Like for a brief moment, we'd stepped into a parallel reality or something. I know it sounds crazy, but it's the only explanation I can come up with. The others don't like to talk about it anymore. We've all drifted apart over the years, as childhood friends often do. But sometimes, late at night, I still dream about that day. I see those purple eyes staring into my soul. I hear that inhuman scream, and I wake up in a cold sweat, wondering what really happened in those woods. I don't go to parks much these days, and I definitely don't own any cats. Around 2 a.m., I was making my usual rounds when something caught my eye. A glowing orb, about the size of a basketball, floating silently through the air. At first I thought I was seeing things, maybe hallucinating from lack of sleep. I rubbed my eyes, but when I looked again, it was still there. The orb was a pale, bluish-white color and seemed to pulse gently as it moved. My heart started racing as I watched it glide across the grounds, heading straight for one of the barracks buildings. I was frozen in place, unsure if I should radio it in or try to follow it. Before I could decide, the orb reached the building, and to my shock, it passed right through the roof, as if it were made of smoke. I stood there for several minutes, waiting to see if it would emerge again, but there was nothing. Eventually, I snapped out of it and radioed my CO to report what I'd seen. Of course, they found nothing when they searched the building. I was told to keep quiet about it and not alarm the other recruits. For weeks afterward, I questioned if I had really seen what I thought I saw. But deep down, I knew it was real. I tried to put the incident out of my mind as I continued my training. A few months later, I was transferred to Camp Lejeune in North Carolina for advanced infantry training. I figured a change of scenery would help me forget about that strange night on Paris Island. How wrong I was. The weird occurrences started almost as soon as I arrived at Lejeune. At first it was just whispered rumors among the recruits, stories of a little girl in a white dress seen wandering the woods at night. I dismissed it as an urban legend, the kind of ghost stories soldiers like to tell to freak each other out. But then more and more guys started claiming they'd seen her themselves. One night, a group of us were out on a training exercise in the woods. We were practicing night maneuvers, moving silently through the trees in full gear. I was on high alert, scanning for any sign of movement in the darkness. Suddenly, I caught a flash of white out of the corner of my eye. I spun around, rifle at the ready, but there was nothing there. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the rumors. I tried to shake it off and focus on the mission, but a few minutes later, I heard one of the other guys whisper, "Holy shit, did you see that?" I looked over and saw the color had drained from his face. He swore he'd seen a small figure in white dart between the trees about 50 yards ahead of us. By this point, my nerves were on edge. I found myself jumping at every snapping twig or rustle of leaves. When we finally made it back to base, several other recruits were shaken up, saying they'd glimpsed the mysterious girl as well. Our CO tried to play it off, saying we were just spooked by the dark and letting our imaginations run wild. But I could tell even he was unsettled by how many of us had seen the same thing. The incident that really pushed me over the edge happened a few weeks later. I was on night watch again, patrolling the perimeter of the base with my buddy Mike. It was around 3 a.m. and dead quiet except for the steady chirp of crickets. Mike and I were making small talk to stay alert when suddenly we heard it, the most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard in my life. It sounded like it was coming from the woods about a quarter-mile away. It started as a high-pitched wail that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Then it shifted into a guttural, almost inhuman roar that seemed to go on forever. Mike and I both instinctively raised our rifles, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. "What the fuck was that?" Mike whispered, his voice shaking. Before I could answer, we heard it again, somehow even louder and more terrifying than before. It was a sound of pure anguish and rage that made my blood run cold. I've heard all kinds of animal calls in those woods, but this was something else entirely. We radioed it in immediately. Within minutes, searchlights were sweeping the forest, and teams were dispatched to investigate. They searched for hours but found absolutely nothing, no signs of any people or animals that could have made that ungodly noise. The next day, the base was buzzing with rumors. Turns out several other groups of Marines had heard the screams as well, all describing the same horrifying sound. Some guys were saying it must have been a mountain lion or some other large predator. But I knew in my gut this was something far stranger. I started having trouble sleeping after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear that scream echoing in my head. I found myself constantly on edge, jumping at small noises and peering into shadows. A few times I could have sworn I caught glimpses of that little girl in white out of the corner of my eye, but she'd always vanish when I turned to look. The fear and paranoia started affecting my performance. My CO noticed and pulled me aside one day, asking if everything was all right. I wanted to tell him about all the weird shit I'd been experiencing, but I was afraid of sounding crazy or weak, so I just blamed it on stress and lack of sleep. But things only got worse from there. One night I woke up in a cold sweat, feeling like someone was watching me. I looked towards the foot of my bunk and saw a dark, hunched figure standing there. Before I could react, it lunged at me with impossible speed. I felt icy fingers wrap around my throat as the thing's face, a hideous, twisted visage, loomed over me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Just as suddenly as it appeared, the figure vanished. I sat up gasping for air, my heart pounding out of my chest. The other guys in the barracks were still sleeping peacefully. Had it just been a nightmare? But it felt so real, and I could still feel the phantom pressure of those fingers on my neck. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and constant anxiety. I started seeing and hearing things constantly, whispers in empty rooms, shadowy figures darting just out of sight, that damn little girl appearing in reflections. I was a wreck, barely able to function. Finally, I broke down and went to the base psychiatrist. I spilled everything, the orb at Paris Island, the girl in the woods, the scream, all of it. He listened patiently, then diagnosed me with PTSD and sleep deprivation. Said my mind was playing tricks on me due to stress. He prescribed some meds and mandatory leave. I wanted to believe him, to think there was a rational explanation for everything I'd experienced. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something otherworldly was going on at those bases, something beyond scientific explanation. It's been years since I left the Marines, but I still have nightmares about my time there. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, sure that I can hear that piercing scream in the distance. I've tried to research similar phenomena at military bases, but there's surprisingly little information out there. Makes me wonder if the government is covering this stuff up. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened to me during those months. Were they genuinely paranormal experiences, mass hallucinations, some kind of experimental military tech gone wrong? All I know is that my time in the Marines showed me that there are things in this world that defy rational explanation. And sometimes, the truth is far stranger and more terrifying than we can imagine. Was a typical humid summer night, and I was out checking my traps as usual. I've got trail cameras set up to monitor the traps remotely, but I like to do regular in-person checks too. As I approached my main trap site, I immediately knew something was off. There was a heavy, oppressive silence in the air. No crickets chirping, no rustling in the underbrush. Just dead quiet. I clicked on my flashlight and swept it across the clearing. What I saw made my blood run cold. The sturdy steel cage trap that normally held 5 to 6 full-grown hogs was twisted and mangled like it was made of tin foil. The gate was ripped clean off its hinges, but that wasn't even the worst part. Inside the destroyed trap were the remains of at least 4 hogs, and I mean remains. These 200-plus-pound animals had been literally torn to shreds. There were chunks of flesh and entrails strewn everywhere. The ground was soaked with blood. In all my years of hunting, I'd never seen carnage like this. My first thought was, maybe a pack of coyotes had somehow gotten into the trap. But coyotes couldn't have done this kind of damage to a steel cage. And the strength required to dismember full-grown hogs like that, it just didn't make sense. With shaking hands, I pulled out my phone to check the trail cam footage. What I saw on that tiny screen will haunt me for the rest of my days. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m. At first, the trap looked normal, with several large hogs milling around inside. Suddenly, a massive dark shape burst into the frame. It moved so fast the camera could barely track it. But in the split second it was visible, I could make out a few chilling details. It was easily 7 feet tall, standing on 2 legs. The body was covered in thick, matted fur. But the face, God, the face. It was like a horrific mix between a wolf and a man. Elongated snout, pointed ears, but with an almost human-like structure to the skull. The creature slammed into the side of the cage with incredible force, warping the steel bars. The hogs inside started squealing in terror. With unnatural strength, it ripped the gate completely off and forced its way inside. What happened next was like something out of a nightmare. The beast tore into those hogs with savage ferocity. Razor-sharp claws and fangs ripped through flesh and bone like it was nothing. The hogs' screams were awful, but mercifully short. Within seconds, they were reduced to scattered pieces of meat. Just as quickly as it appeared, the monster vanished back into the darkness. The whole attack lasted less than a minute. I stood there in shock, trying to process what I'd just seen. Part of me wanted to convince myself it was some kind of hoax or camera malfunction. But the gruesome scene in front of me was all too real. I'm not ashamed to admit I hightailed it out of there as fast as I could. I spent that whole night huddled in my cabin with my rifle, jumping at every little sound. The next morning, I went back to survey the damage in the light of day. If anything, it looked even worse. I took some photos to document it, though my hands were shaking so bad they came out blurry. I thought about calling the cops, but what the hell would I even say? I had no proof beyond a mangled trap and some butchered hogs. I decided to set up more cameras around my property, including at the feeding stations where I bait the hogs. Maybe I was crazy, but I had to know if that thing was still out there. For the next week, I barely slept. I constantly checked the camera feeds on my phone, but saw nothing unusual. Just as I was starting to think maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, it happened again. This time it was at one of my corn feeders, about a half-mile from the first attack. The footage showed a group of maybe 8 to 10 hogs gathered around the feeder at dusk. Suddenly they all froze, like they sensed danger. A second later, that same monstrous shape came hurtling out of the tree line. The hogs scattered, but they didn't stand a chance. This thing was impossibly fast. It snatched up a 150-pound boar in each hand and literally ripped them in half. The others tried to flee, but it bounded after them with inhuman speed and agility. Within moments, the clearing was littered with hog carcasses. This time, I got a clearer look at the creature. It was definitely lupine in appearance, but far larger than any wolf I'd ever seen. The way it moved on two legs was unsettling, sometimes loping on all fours, other times standing upright like a man. Its eyes glowed an eerie yellow in the fading light. Once again, the attack was over in a flash. The beast dragged one of the hog carcasses off into the woods, leaving the others where they fell. I don't mind telling you, I was scared out of my mind. I've been around dangerous animals my whole life, but this was something else entirely. I started carrying my rifle everywhere, even to take a piss. I reinforced the doors and windows of my cabin. Barely slept more than an hour at a time. It's been a few weeks now since the last sighting. I've thought about selling my land and getting the hell out of here. But this is my home, damn it. My family has lived on this property for generations. I can't just abandon it. So here I am, living in a constant state of hypervigilance, always watching the tree line, always listening for any strange sounds. I've read up on werewolf lore, but most of it seems like Hollywood bullshit. Silver bullets, full moons. Who knows what's real and what isn't? All I know is there's something out there, something that shouldn't exist, and it's only a matter of time before our paths cross again. I just hope I'm ready when it happens. I'm not sure why I'm sharing all this. Maybe I just needed to get it off my chest. Maybe I'm hoping someone out there has experienced something similar and can tell me I'm not going crazy. All I can say is, be careful out there in the woods. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, and some of them have teeth and claws.